This is another experiment of three of us meeting now that the hurly-burly's done to discuss some topics. We are bringing in Katarina. I'm going to hand it over to you. Can you just say hi at first and say your name and go from there?
Sure. My name's Katarina Pejović, and I'm really happy to be here. I am a PhD student at the University of Toronto. I also write a lot about Balkan folk magic. I'm from Serbia originally, and necromancy and witchcraft and various spirits and traditions that come from the former Yugoslavia as well as just the Balkans in general. And yeah, many of the things that I like to talk about in general involve sort of oral lineages of folk myths and stories and the way that they're handed down and preserved and changed over time. So I'm very fascinated just by transmission of breath to words and into text. There are cases they do get codified, which did happen in some cases in Serbia, especially through Vuk Karadžić, who I'm sure we'll touch on at some point. But yeah, I'm very excited to be here and just to talk a lot about all the lovely things we have planned.
It's really nice to have you on the show.
It's such a shame, right? That was like so much more professional than we normally are. When are you going to grow up, Al?
Never.
When you go to conferences and stuff at universities, like you get used to just giving a quick spiel. But it's also just terrifying because I hate talking about myself.
Well, luckily we get to talk about the things that we find interesting rather than literally ourselves, which is I always thought was my preference.
Thought might be interesting a few months back when we made topic lists.
Well, that too. Yeah. What did we set ourselves as homework? Oh dear Lord. Okay.
This is Radio Free Golgotha because I don't believe we've hashtagged ourselves yet.
No.
So welcome to Radio Free Golgotha. This is Gussie and Al and Katarina.
Hiya.
Today, Al?
Today we are here to talk about a very particular saint, or kind of saint, I suppose we could say, which I'll leave you to talk about more in a second. But in terms of Sesame Streeting our syllabus before us this evening, we have discussion of the demon Agliarept, or many of the other ways that can be said, and maybe we can try and find the weirdest one, and their counterparting Exu of Quimbanda, Exu Mangueira. We're also here to talk about the plant Datura, the stone the Belzebuth, hopefully a discussion around the type of magics of sorcery. And I've written down here sorcery versus witchcraft, which sounds like quite the battle royale, but certainly compare and contrast, show and tell on sorceress versus witchcrafty modalities of practice in general. Also, this episode is brought to you by the geomantic figure of Conjunctio, and of course, then the Odu Viwari.
Latin Jehovah begins with an I, Al.
Which Latin? Is it your church Latin? Is it the Latin that was shoved down people's throats that had nothing to do with the Latin that was spoken? Is it? Is it really?
That is not. That's a new bill for a lot of history. As evidenced by linguistic shift, as opposed to Church Latin, which was invented in the 1860s. So history before you start throwing stones. People like to change vowels and then pretend that other languages don't know what they're talking about.
Before I start throwing Belzebuths.
You know, that I don't care about.
They're quite rare. At least expensive.
Basically a Belzebuth, but much less expensive.
Oh yeah, we're also talking about the Hanged Man for our Major Arcana, and this is exciting for our magical forebear of the session is the Witch of Endor. So I'll be diving into the first book of Samuel a little bit as well.
Love walks.
But first, and perhaps most importantly, Jesse, tell us about the Feast of the Holy Relics.
Okay, so we haven't even mentioned what it is. That's what we're doing, but so I proposed that this discussion on the Feast of Holy Relics happened because it's an interesting. I don't often come with notes, and I have 9 pages of notes on things I find interesting about this feast day because it has no actual fixed date. It's celebrated as early as October 26th and goes through usually like mid-November, November 14th, 15th. It's generally agreed upon. Most celebrated date is November 5th, but it is felt to be important to be celebrated within the octave, the 8 days of All Saints, All Souls. Holy Relics celebrates the fact that saints' bones and body parts are things that we can get to God through. That is the official CCD. No, but the idea that physical objects left by those people who died in a state of grace then allow us to participate in that grace in some way, or on a very mundane level, have a better telephone communication with God. And that idea of relics has been hotly contested, especially by the Protestant Reformation and forward. And there's lesser reliance on relics and this tangible connection to history as the Protestant Reformation starts to take hold. And I find that interesting because of the idea that the Reformation was the start of the death of miracle and the last bastion of magic. Magic started to die after this point. Whether that's true or not, I don't think it is, but I think that the public perception of it, and certainly a shift that coincides with the Industrial Revolution, and by the time we get to that, it's a different mindset.
Sure, yeah.
But that the idea of relics themselves and the historicity of Jesus, which is always a contested issue, that even Paul, as a major father of the church, never met the historical Jesus, and was, met the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. And Damascus, I hope that's right. I'm gonna get beat by some nun's relic after this.
I think so.
But also that the historicity of the gospel is also what gives the church its authority.
Right.
And this is an interesting thing, because the minute you can say that it's Peter that was the spiritual successor to Jesus, and that the Roman Catholic Church founds its authority based upon its descendants from Peter, his genealogy from Peter and the laying on of hands from those apostles, it changes this into a very tangible history that is not unlike what is proposed in Judaism, of like the lists of being able to name your ancestors back to one of the biblical lists that then takes you back to Adam and therefore God.
Right.
So the relics are an interesting segue into that. There's many other subjects they bring up for me. But I love this idea that there's all saints, there's all souls, and then in the further celebration of that mystery, not just their heavenly acceptance into heaven as, this split theology that starts to happen of are people already resurrected in a timeline? Because the medieval mind was that there was a judgment day. It's the tarot card of the judgment, right? At some point, the tombs will open, and this is when people are resurrected, but not until that point. Right. So there's this thing that the saints are already in heaven as the elect, because we have evidence of this from performing miracles. Yes. So their state of grace is such that they are assumed spirit-wise, not necessarily bodily, into heaven. And this is, as we talked about the Assumption of Mary and her being bodily assumed into heaven, there's this side of it that there's this future promise of the New Jerusalem, of the physical paradise that the saints are already participating in. This promise of resurrection is already fulfilled for them, at least in spirit. Certainly not in body, because we're keeping their bodies captive, and that'd be really weird for them to be. Which I also find the concept of saint relics quite fascinating from a necromantic point of view, especially Mediterranean necromancy, which would be if you have unburied bones, they are creating restless dead. Yeah. And so this idea of this is a concept sometimes referred to as forcing the saint by me in my own head. I don't remember the proper Spanish term for it. There is one. But the idea that there's an argument of like, is this really Jesus's foreskin? Is this really St. Lucy's skull? Right. Even if it isn't, the dead person that it is has no rest unless you get them to perform miracles for you, and then you give them a mass, or you give them flowers, or you give them some sense of rest through the sacrifice of the mass in getting that bone to perform miracles. Now, is it the same thing as having a direct physical link to the actual saint that you're venerating? No, but we know that there are 3 skulls of Mary Magdalene in France alone. Right. And things broaden out from there. Now, unless she was tricephalic, which would be awesome, she is the original Hecate, or at least her chosen on earth. This is going into a tangent that I don't think I intended. But
heresy.
Yeah. So, which I think this whole concept of what this is. I mean, the other thing that I like about the Feast of the Holy Relics is it really lets us dive into how ritual can be created, because it's exemplar in the Missal. It has original prayers that are unique to it, but those aren't really hard to write. You just have to write Latin, because we won't be able to pronounce it like the Brits who pronounce everything correctly. But
thank you.
You did invent all languages. Yes. That's right. especially Enochian. But
Flips table of practice.
yes. Where are you gonna get your sweet wood now, Al? So that in the structure of the day itself, that it shows us how ritual can be created and therefore make something new. Where the introit is actually from one of the feasts of St. Peter and Paul, that is, the Lord keepeth all their bones, and out of them will the Lord deliver them. That the epistle is no, the introit is actually the feast of John and Paul. Sorry, my notes are scribble. But then the epistle is from Peter and Paul, who were the first among the foundational relics that the Pope built churches over. And then also what's interesting about John and Paul is that they were the first martyrs buried in a church in Rome. So there's this conceptual thing of like, who were the first major relics that we can look back to? And the biblical verses of like their bodies are buried in peace and their name liveth from generation unto generation. So this playing on like the sanctity of the bones in that way, playing on the promise of resurrection. And then the gospel is from the Vigil of All Saints. So it's referencing something that just happened to kind of give it one last boost. And the chants that are used in the Mass, there's no Gregorian chant that's unique to it. And there's no, in the scriptures I just talked about, but that the various chants, and both Gregorian and otherwise, are piecemealed from the feasts of various early martyrs, so that they all kind of go in there and swirl it around.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, like it shows an example of how effective ritual can be done when you're trying to work with a concept. And I find it fascinating. You guys know Nathan down in NOLA. He was just sent me these pictures of he was in the cathedral of St. Louis, and they asked him if he wanted to see the relics, and their relics are kept in a specific case that has its own triptych, and there's beautiful just saint relics displayed in a certain way that many of the old, especially French and Spanish churches, have an area where there's just, we don't even necessarily know, we just know this was some saint. It's from a giant grave of saints that was found, and this adoration of the bones into complex geometrical shapes, and the kind of adoration of relics in that way as a force of godhood, like a wall of God staring at you, that is different from the physical transubstantiation, the host, which is a product of transubstantiation as the body of Christ. And for Catholics and high prots, that is still considered the indwelling presence of God on earth, because we don't have the ark is in Ethiopia, so we don't have that to go off of anymore.
Right, it's transient, right? The host doesn't stay the host if it's not blessed and consumed by someone in the communion of the saints, right?
It can be held in the tabernacle and in a monstrance. So those are different things of you can display it, but different dogmas and different denominations will have different beliefs.
Right.
The other thing that and this is why I'm sorry, there's so much that's interesting to me about this. Feel free to be like, slow down. But it also brings up the concept of translation of relics that is celebrated, and not just the death day of a saint.
Right.
So oftentimes a local church, some of the major feast days that we think of have nothing to do with the death day of the saint, which is just the most common feast day of the saint within a day or two of the death. But for instance, Walpurgisnacht isn't her feast day is February 25th. That's the day of her death. Why do we celebrate Walpurgisnacht? Well, this is the day of her canonization and the translation of her relics, which were then installed in Eichstätt. I can't pronounce German normally. But this translation, the moving of the bones, which plays into my own lovely adoration of that night as something of very significance. We're not celebrating death. We're celebrating the flight of the bones that are then exhumed from one place and enshrined in another in full glorification. Right.
Which is also crucially usually often about the prestige or the grace or the glory or the straight up economic benefit from becoming a pilgrim hub of the bones turning up. So there's a wider sense of like why you would celebrate these turning up at these times, the time that our church came into itself as possessing these things.
Yeah, certainly. I think in Paris, there is I think it's like December 3rd or 4th, they have a day that is specifically the reception of the relics, like when a major relic caravan arrived,
right?
That had like throne of crown of thorns and some strands of the Virgin Mary's hair and other things. So like, it's this interesting thing of like, when does it validates the spirit body of the church by giving a physical body as well, which is perhaps why, in addition to the shadow side of the church being a political entity that has property, that it also does bring some spiritual validation for that, or perhaps spiritual bypassing, I'm not sure which one, of demanding that there be a foundation of the church that's built upon relics, built upon this connection to the past.
Right. And so, yeah, to reiterate then, the Feast of the Holy Relics may have begun over some specific relics, but like All Souls and All Saints, it is about it's one of those catch-all ones, right? It's a Milocan kind of take.
Yeah.
It does it all.
And it's, I mean, November 5th is highly celebrated because there's a lot of martyrs that died on that day. So it became kind of like, oh, this is a prominent possibility within there. But it's obviously at this time of year where we're looking forward into the darkness to come. And what that is, the promise of, and the hope of resurrection is there. I also think it brings up the whole question of what a relic is to begin with. In addition to, yes, we're talking about like restless dead and necromancy and things like that, which are things that I know you and I've talked about. I'm not sure how much heretical orangutan poop I'm going to get thrown at me from that. But the idea of a first-class relic being a physical part of the saint or something associated with Christ. So Christ, because we don't have the physical body of Christ. I mean, we would never say that, even if we do. But the idea that the bones that will be pieced together Voltron-like at the resurrection are dispersed, the fingernails, the hair, the things like this that are of the body. And then there's second class, which is most usually something they touched. The clothing, I think it's Indumentis relics, is replying to his clothing that they wore, or their particular psalter or things like that. The third class relics are things that touched a first or a second class relic. And there are people that talk about a fourth class relic being something that's touched one of the other relics. So then the third class is the ex brandeas, which refers most heavily to cloth. So clothing that had touched a tomb that you could then scrap, you could cut that entire thing you were wearing that day, if that's what you visited the tomb of a saint in, and sell those as relics. Well, not sell. You would get donations for those things. And this is what you commonly see where, like I have a friend who habitually goes to holy sites and takes a bolt of red cloth with them and touches the bolt of red cloth to it and then has relics for all of us. Yeah. To be that traveler. So I find all that really fascinating. And in current event wise, I saw this article going around that talks about the sour toe cocktail. You know about that?
Yes. Trey shared it with me.
Yeah, so the sour toe cocktail was in Yukon in Canada, and he found a frostbitten toe, put it in alcohol and started serving it, and was really sad just about the fact that there's just this toe that's separated from somebody's body, and so a whiskey from a glass that contains some of this pickled human toe. Now the guy who had started that is, when he dies, going to donate his toes to keep the tradition going. Yeah. Made an interesting side of it, because then it made me question, like, well, the drink is technically a relic, but is it first class or second class? Because it's something that's touched the relic, but then by science, we know that the whiskey is absorbing part of that relic. So tinctured saints, or tinctured relics at least, become something of interest.
Brings up a lot of fascinating things with like early Christianity and the way that like these martyrs who were like early saints, people would go into their tombs and try and like take the oil from the lamps and like rub it on themselves, or like get away with sneaking pieces of, the saint's or martyr's body home with them. Just the idea that like this person died and was able to go to heaven and had this like virtuous sort of afterlife. And if I have a piece of it on me, or if I rub it on my skin, like it'll transfer to me and lead me to that same fate.
I was reading about how we find the tradition of even what gets called Peter Stone a lot of the time, at least in the British Isles, of even chipping off bits of poking out bits of statuary of saints as well. That even there's a likeness thing going on there, a similitude of it's in their tomb and it's of their likeness, and so we'll chip it off and grind it down and use it for anything from protecting our cattle to curing kids to more explicitly devotional practices as well.
Yeah, it's very common with wooden statues to be able to get a sliver, and also because it's easy to break off.
Yeah, they was talking about noses was done a lot, which is also obviously, something that many of the Protestant iconoclasts were also doing. But that is interesting to think that, when you look at, a medieval statue and it's battered around the edges and part, fingers have come off and chins and noses and things, that might not be because someone was trying to, desecrate it or destroy it. It may have come from an incredibly devout but desperate person.
Yeah, the nose thing is interesting because I would love to read more on that, because it brings to mind what was directly done during the conquest of the New World, where native idols' hands and just like genitals being removed from classical statues in Europe.
Right.
Removing hands, feet, demarcating the face, removing the ears of a deity, removing the nose, because the Christian belief that the soul exits and enters through the nose.
Right.
So there's the breath of God is put in through that area, not through the mouth. He's not giving you CPR. He's, I guess, mouth kissing you, or nose kissing you, something. When he gives
rude.
Yeah, I mean it's a form of kiss. Truly, open kisses, I think they're called, something like that. But yeah, it's interesting. You see recipes for powerful drinks in different Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Brazilian traditions. They call for the shard of a saint statue, meaning a wood statue. So I think that's
fascinating.
The wood is then saturated with the incense, with the prayers of everybody in it and everything like that. Feel a part of that. With the feast day as a physical token of the saint is in fact a form of relic. And I suppose you could go through contagion and be like, well, it touched the stone, that touched the wood, that touched the stone, that touched the altar, that touched the relic. So it's a first-class relic.
Right. Yeah, third class get not tricky. Gets a very broad category when you start to think like that, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why people unofficially refer to things as fourth class relics.
Yeah.
It'd be like, that's not, how many degrees of separation between you and God? Well, if you're a Catholic, could be many. If you're Protestant, apparently none. So, 1 point for the Protestants.
So it's been a while since I read Peter Brown's Cult of the Saints, but having a resident theologian here, or at least someone with some formal theology training, Kat, what's your take on this notion that, far from being an extension of pagan hero elevation, that this early Christian necromancy was kind of more marked by contrast to those pagan practices than a continuation or development on?
I think it's fascinating because on the one hand, like, I can see how these practices can be regarded as being in that kind of tension, but intention always breeds conversation. And especially with the risk of new Christians going back to paganism, going back to the risk of Neoplatonism coming as this kind of rising, in its newest form at the time, as a rising star that could, sway people over back to like their usual practices, but now you also get salvation, and so on and so forth, right? So it's, but there's something very fascinating about the way that saints come into it and the way that the relics especially come into it, because it's different than the way that Neoplatonists conceive of, the ascent to godhood, or like catching into the train of these deities that are circling, right? This theurgy aspect of it, where, you end up progressing higher and higher to the spheres of your chosen deity and getting absorbed in that current. Although there is something similar going on, right? Like if I can have the physical remains of the saint on me, if I can rub the oil from the martyr's lamps on my skin, that'll help me closer to, in a way, his train, the way that the saint is moving my soul's ascent to the afterlife. Very deeply, I think, death-based in it. That's not the case in other competitors, right? Is that, I forget who it was exactly, you'll have to forgive me, but there was this Roman judge. And a few Roman judges actually were talking about this, but there's this one letter I recall reading where he was getting very frustrated because he would have all these Christians coming up to him and basically asking for a death penalty. So he'd be like, look, I'm a Christian. I'm not repenting of that. I'm not, well, it's not even a matter of belief. It was more that they weren't sacrificing to the emperor, right? So he'd be like, hey, I'm not actually doing all these things I'm supposed to be doing to be a good Roman citizen. I'm all weird and antisocial, not to mention that I refuse to, participate in these public festivals or bring honors to the emperor. I won't even burn incense for him. There was a whole controversy with were they, maybe you can pay off the guy who checks your name off the list to see if you've given the offering to the emperor. And then some Christians were saying, no, that's still falling into sin, because then you're acknowledging the authority. You have to go all the way and completely abstain from the practice, not even acknowledge that it exists, or its authority over you. And so, at the end of the day, I think from the records that we have, most Christians at the time did end up either giving the offering or actually getting their names checked off and paying the guy off, because, it would throw you in jail otherwise, because the emperors were trying to figure out, these Christians seem to be this big political enemy, so we got to get rid of them, or at least figure out who they are and make sure that they come on their line, and they can have their weird little cults where they eat their own god and they call each other brother and sister and kiss each other. But they do need to actually, know who's in charge here. And so despite all of that, you had these people who were kind of eager for martyrdom. They were coming forward and they were saying, hey, I'm ready. Basically come at me. And and oftentimes they'd be turned back. They'd be like, no, like there was this one, I wish I knew his name. There's this one Roman judge who was like, no, actually, like this, you're clearly wanting to die, because I know what happens to you people when you die. People love your bones and suddenly you're this hero. And then it encourages more of you weird suicidal people, like, go away, and they kept coming back. And eventually this judge was writing to another judge saying, my hands are tied. I'm going to execute this person, And so this longing for this death is, you have to understand the historical context. Is people were thinking that the second coming is any moment now. It could be,
right.
And you will not, you will likely experience it in your lifetime. And the further away it came to be, people got more anxious about it, and then it became what happens when the children of these people don't remember the memory of the initial movement. And so on. And so there's this sense of urgency, right? We could get, tortured or captured at any moment, right? But if we face that doom with, and this is not like a calm philosophical sort of, yes, I understand there's a lot of risks in death and there's a possibility of reincarnating into something that I would rather not be, but, I get to do my contemplation and eventually, move up the spheres myself. You get this intense urgency, like I could really die an awful death, soon rather than later. And I really hope that either I can be a light for future people, or because touching the relics somehow made me want to have that experience myself and be myself like a martyr and so on. So this is interesting. I find it really fascinating, all these early texts about martyrs and how gung-ho a lot of them were about becoming martyrs, and people, early martyrdom stories like Polycarp becoming these fantastic tales that mimic the death of Christ, the fact that he cannot be burned. He gets pierced with a lance on his side and his blood flows out like a fountain and ends up putting out the flames. And he finally, like after all this torture days endured and nothing seems to wound him, kind of like, our favorite Cyprian Justina in the Cauldron, he looks up and he's like, I'm ready now, and he hears, the Lord's voice being like, telling him to come forth. So it's this whole sense of urgency. It's this sense of like transcendence through death but also weirdly, the necromantic angle of it is so fascinating to me that, torturing saints and agitating their bones so they can't really rest. They have to stick around and be these intercessors for us, right?
Right.
At the same time, people wanting that ending for themselves, wanting to kind of be one of the dominoes in the falling line of getting other people to salvation in a time when apocalypse is coming at any moment. I
love that notion of the of what we're doing is we're kind of riding on the saints' coattails. As they like rocket through the spheres themselves. And
yet, they're here, right? We're agitating their bones and, on some level that they are forced to kind of remain at these crossroads figures for us.
Yeah, that these Christian works of thaumaturgy become a kind of, they're powered by a dynamo that has these restless dead running on it. Like they're riding the spectral necromantic bicycles hooked up to the generator.
Which can be terrifying, I guess, as a state of being. But at the same time, like all of these gung-ho would-be martyrs, hoping to become proto-saints, themselves. There's a sense of like, but it's coming so soon, right? Jesus coming back so soon. And there's a risk. There's always this anxiety. More and more people are giving these offerings. More and more people are bribing these guards. More people are not being proper Christians, right? The baptism is going to be our seal. But what happens when you're not a better person for it, or you're still, you're still coveting your neighbor's wife? What happens when you're not this morally perfected person despite being reborn in this way, right? Then I think one of the anxieties is like, we're going to lose too many people. So if we can get a train moving, where everyone follows, whether it's through martyrdom or through being inspired by and shaken by the martyrs, then they'll remember how important and serious this time is.
I think it plays too into, it's worth noting that the only quality of sainthood in the early days was martyrdom.
Yeah, precisely. They weren't even called saints yet.
They weren't
saints. The witness.
Martyrs. They died for their faith.
Mm-hmm.
So virginity and chastity was the way of preserving that in your lifetime to keep your body holy and to live a chaste life, which is different from being a virgin. But the idea of being in congress with the state of grace, that then if you can die in that state of grace by keeping your faith, no matter what the tortures presented to you. So this notion of the restless Christian dead that are the saints are also blessed. They're at war. They're at war with Satan. And they're actively at war. They are on the cross with Christ in his suffering as a saint, even after death. That is their job, to be at the crux between these things. And that part fascinates me, because you also get into the notion of the good thief is actually the verification of this, that Jesus says, you will be with me this day in paradise. So there is no possible way for that thief to meet Catholic canonical concepts of the resurrection. The day of resurrection happens in the future, because that good thief in repenting right there becomes someone who's in agony with Jesus. It's the model for what sainthood is about. Idea that you then are at war through being at peace in some ways. And also the idea that if you die a martyr, you become instantly put into heaven. You will not have to go through the horrors of 1,000-year Armageddon, which will happen if you go through Judgment Day the normal way.
And also makes more sense of why their bones are capable of being worked along with being restless, like what they are put to do.
Definitely. I mean, it certainly seems like that. Right. It's a fascinating part of it. I mean, how someone recently putting up the idea of a necromantic saint, and my argument is like, all saints are necromantic. All saints are necromantic. It's like part of what their doctrine is. We're not talking about someone, the idea of what it is within Christianity, especially within the Catholic doctrine, that there is a physical person that died. And now, of course, the process is far more rigorous than it used to be, but that's true of many things, including exorcism.
And the concentration on relics, as you well pointed out earlier, means that even if this figure might be reclassified on some revisionist turn as being more mythic than ever a real person, if there's a skull in a reliquary that is called, that saint, then there's some dead fella there who's been receiving prayers and empowerment for probably a while.
Any conflation between those things, the parable Lazarus versus the historical Lazarus,
right?
The three sets of Cosme and Damian, the different Mary Magdalene heads, what exactly are we dealing with here? So I love this concept of relic, because I think it plays into the materialism that from the early divide, even from Sumerian texts, right, of necromancy of the spirit versus necromancy of the body.
Sciomancy versus necromancy, yeah,
and that there is almost a universal understanding now of it talking about spirit and never physical remains. And up until recently, it was much harder to get physical remains unless you dug them up yourself. But human bones are far more trafficable than they used to be with the advent of the internets, and certainly at least to be discussed and talked about, because it is not illegal in every state. In many states, you can purchase human remains if you meet certain qualifications, and others you can purchase them outright no matter what. Crossing them over state borders is its own thing. And it just brings up whole beautiful things of what does it mean? Like, are you dealing with notions even of collective dead when you go into a lot of traditional Catholic cemetery structures of a family ossuary? So like the tomb of the most recent person buried in the center.
Right.
And unless they're a notable ancestor, they're kind of just taken apart and put into, all the skulls go here and the long bones go here, because those are the bones we need for resurrection, which is its own thing. That whole myth of that whole lore of the loose bone, that might be the C7 vertebra, it might be the tailbone, femurs, because that's the height of the man or woman, and their skull, this type of thing of skull and crossbones being symbolic of the height and breadth of the person. And therefore you can be resurrected from those things. It's one of the reasons that the church forbids division of relics past a recognizable point. So if it's a fingernail, it should look like a fingernail.
Right.
It could be woolly mammoth hair or something like that. And you get that with like saints like Rosalia, who,
goat bones
most likely. And that's nothing. Maybe she was a goat shapeshifter, and that's fine.
Right. It was all done a cappella. Yeah.
That's hilarious.
I have my moments. I have been thinking about this in terms of churchyards more broadly as well. And so I and the stuff I've been looking at in the Cyprianic material in the Sparkkunstwoche, the compendium that we released through Revelor Press of the works of Dr. the late Dr. Thomas Johnson. So I've been looking at borrowing bones, usually borrowing them from churchyards, usually for healing practices. And I was discussing this with a friend, and they pointed out the similarities with it's treating the bone, which, by the way, it just says, you go to a churchyard, you ask permission, you dig up some bones, you take them, you do a thing with them, either transfer the disease to them via morning dew on a summer's day, or cook them up or heat them up and put them in water, and then use that water to wash someone as a healing bath while an exhortation is said over it. But then you return the bones, and this friend of mine pointed out that this is very like treating these otherwise anonymous bones from a churchyard as a saint. So there's kind of this idea of like a hyper-local saint. There's nothing in either of the texts or any of the texts I've looked at so far that suggests that the bones are treated like a saint. They're not, you don't dig them up and say, I baptize you as the finger of St. Peter or whatever. But there's still that layer of practice with them, where crucially either the bone is shepherding the disease away from you, and in those transferences it's buried, and as it's buried you say, as I cover you with earth, may the disease rot in the ground now. But the human bone soup one is especially interesting to me because it's a power of healing that is harvested from heating the bones and putting them in water. You're not transferring to the bones, you're transferring a healing virtue to the water from the bones that you're then healing someone with. And so this idea that that the bones themselves are radiating a healing virtue rather than a psychopomp of disease taking them away to the underworld. So that notion of applying that potentially any relic in any bone in a churchyard was certainly used at a folk level, like a saint's bone as well.
I find that super fascinating. There's something very similar in a lot of different Serbian villages I'm familiar with, where the body of someone who's passed, who it was known that magic was done on them, can be used for the same purpose that magic was used. So, for example, Sveti Cosma and Damian, so Cosmos and Damian, they are not a lot of lore on them in the official Orthodox sort of doctrine, but hugely popular. Venerated very much for healing, but also for Tsarna magia, or black magic, as we say. So they are often petitioned to heal people, and the person who heals, and when they die, their body can be reused to kind of remind the saints, hey, remember when you did this?
Yes.
For this other person, right?
They become witnesses again.
Yeah, exactly. They become witnesses to the original act, or someone who was killed through them. Big folk necromancy, but they can be used for plenty of sort of curses and so on. You get someone who died that way, you can use them to, the bone becomes like a plague. It becomes this contamination. So you can bury under someone's lot to make their cows lose their ability to have milk, or to make their finances drain, and so on. There's a lot of wealth / milk / fertility stealing sort of magic, especially with weaponizing your own house spirit versus someone else's house spirit.
Yeah.
So it becomes this kind of, my house is cooler than your house sort of thing, where the local, because they're conceived of as serpents before they became these gnome-like, they're called Vedas sometimes, these fathers or grandfathers, but these original serpent spirits under the houses, you could weaponize them against each other. So it would go out and get you the milk, which would then bring it back to your cow and make it more fertile and so on. But then when that thing dies, you can use it as a reminder to your spirit, remember when you did this? So I find that super fascinating, because I've been reading a lot about and talking to people recently about sort of this notion of how the bones of people for whom miracles were made manifest are reused. And this is especially true when you want to, let's say, do something with the spirit of someone who died, but you don't have them. Let's say, and this is rare because normally, you live next to a village that has all the people buried anyway around it. But in case you move, or in case, you get married, especially as a woman, and you go to a completely different place, what happens when you need to access the spirit of someone who normally you could literally go directly to their grave? And there's this fun thing where you can take the bones, or the human remains of someone who, let's say, magic was performed on for similar purposes, take it out and tell it, either you will become this person that I'm trying to do magic on or trying to contact, or I'm going to force you to do it instead. And so you're going to be forced to wander or do whatever I need you to do. and I'll use you, or you'll give up your possession of this bone and become the other person. So there's this like ability to transmute spirits into the physical remains through agency of saints as well as other spirits and so on.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating, and kind of combines that like the element of forcing there again.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a threat.
I find that fascinating with the some of the other black arts book stuff, like the operation I think we were talking about to get a skull to reveal lottery numbers to you in dream. On the one hand, it says that you go to a churchyard and you ask permission to take the skull, but then when the spirit turns up, it demands its head back, and there's a sense that the idea of like heavy scare bunny quote is you've asked permission, you've stated that you're doing it, and then you're holding onto the skull until you get those sweet lottery number picks, and then they can have their skull back. So,
yeah, I'm not bringing it back until you give me what I asked for. Right.
So you've asked permission and you're going to return it, but also you haven't really waited for them to give permission.
It's like we're putting icons upside down and so on.
I'm curious what that is too, because does it specifically mention that you ask permission of the spirit itself?
I would need to check, but that's a very good point, because that's what I was wondering as well.
Oftentimes in Catholic magic, you ask permission of God to do anything.
Mm-hmm.
But do a prayer to God, or like the bless every work prayer that is common in your people, the bearded ones. The idea that you ask permission of God, even in Mexico, right, to invoke Santísima Muerte, to ask permission of the omnipresent Tata Dios to call upon an angel, to call upon the angel of death, to call upon the guardian angel of someone else. Right. So the notion of it could be very interesting to also, I mean, I have no idea what the specific technology that is, because it's different cultural things there. But that idea too, that you could ask permission of the graveyard and of the sanctity of the church and the saints that there dwell to go do what you're going to do, but have not actually asked permission of the person who it belongs to. So it's kind of like sneaking into a place and borrowing the uniform of one of the wait staff, and then that wait staff's like, "Yo, I'm naked over here. Like, what's going on?" Well, the doorman let me in.
Yeah.
And I'll give it back to you when I'm done with it. Similarly, the thing with the boiling of the bones is interesting, because to offer an alternative viewpoint, this is there's some New Mexican Rio Grande Valley type of thing where boiling bones means that you've made a death broth, and this is death to disease. And you tell the bones as they're boiling that their job is to take the disease with them. So it's not necessarily viewed like, and I don't know what this, but it has a similar thing. Instead of the bones transferring it, you're using the broth as a type of holy water that's been blessed,
right,
to then go kill disease itself. It's actually considered a baptism of the disease itself, or giving it its confession as that little demon that is the disease of like, here's your choice,
right.
But it is, you can now accept Christ as your Lord and Savior, or you can be put on the list of what I'm extending a metaphor of how I'm condemned to warm in outer darkness. But
that's fascinating. Yeah.
That it might not necessarily be viewed as healing so much as the end purpose is healing, but that extending the natural state of bones, which are at rest because they were in a graveyard, you took them out of rest to do something with them, to then be able to put them at rest again, only to use the water to take the disease and wash the person of it.
Right.
Because the average person, if you said that you were going to clean them as a folk healer, and you took out smelly bones from your cabinet, we're like, I'm just going to pass these over your body. That's okay, great. Yeah, don't report me to the priest. As opposed if it's just like a funny colored tea that smells kind of off, like maybe that's easier.
That's a very good point. It's a very good point. Plausible deniability.
I think, not that we haven't talked about this a lot, and can continue to bring it in, but I find some lovely fascination here with not only conjunctio as this bringing of things together, and the intersection, the natural kind of Vesica Pisces that is the figure of conjunctio, or in the British conjunctio, and also the bezoar as this kind of weird after relic of the body of like this. It's not a body of light, but a body of retaliation. The body has made a stone,
right?
Something that shouldn't exist there.
Out of hair.
Yeah, out of calcite. So the kidney stones, bezoars. Like, what do you do with that? Can you save your kidney stones? I mean, that'd be a lot easier than paying for a goat bezoar half the time. But sometimes the episodes are kind of designed, and this one was to kind of see this flow between these things in this way.
Yeah. Conjunctio is the mercurial figure of geomancy that I associate with Gemini as opposed to Virgo. Some of the attributations, as we frequently discuss, swap those round, and geomancers are often very, very idiosyncratic about their particular correspondences. But the shape of it is the familiar metal horns. If we were to do the geomantic gang signs with it, 2, 1, 1, 2. Its shape recalls an X, right? It's the X that marks the spot. There's an X of crossing. We can think about it like that, a site of crossing. Not the traveler who crosses, crucially, but the place at which crossings happen, right? Via is a lot more like that, which does the crossing, is the kind of das almas to the encruciadas, if we want. Like, the X is also like that kind of hourglass pinch, right, of attesting choice and change and chance. And it's referred to as a liminal figure because it's neither exiting, it doesn't have a pointy end nearer the top or a pointy end nearer the bottom, and so isn't really stable either. And I think about it as that kind of liminal knife point of decision making, where the immovable object meets the unstoppable force. That they're both, the chevrons are both pointing inwards. And I like the idea that it's the X of an illiterate signature as well. It's the X on the contract that you can't read. And we're also back to kisses again as well. The idea of it being an exchange or something that's sealed with a kiss as well, along with it having being devil horns and then having some metal associations, which itself is from what Dio's nona, right? It's another Italian blessing, right, or exorcism of cursing of some kind. And it makes me think, again, like considering it as a figure of union, as a figure of bringing things together, a figure of like crossing things. It often seems to rule, children. So it's assemblage on the one hand, and it's invention. It's combining that which we don't know to discover what we do know, to discover that which we don't. I think a lot of cut up is present there. The coagula to the salve is there. But I also think like people of two worlds are there as well. The bilinguality, if that is indeed a term, seems to be a very conjunctio concept, and from that kind of hybridity that it suggests as well very often. But I also like this idea that hybridity is rooted in two things at once, rather than being this like floating artificial syncretism. That it's the bridge itself, right, and the very midst through which such a bridge passes, as opposed to, again, like via being the crossing of the bridge. And when we're into bridges, that also kind of makes me think of Nahuatl concepts of Nepantla. Am I saying that right? And I was reading. We've definitely talked about this before. We might have talked about this on the show, but Gloria and Zaldua's thing about bridges as thresholds to other realities, and this take on the world entirely in the middle kind of thing, the transformations that occur in an in-between space, an unstable, unpredictable, just precarious, always in transition space. And again, like living in this liminal zone, being in a constant state of displacement, but that's also can become a sort of home. And she says through this state, it links us to other ideas, peoples, and worlds.
Yeah, Nepantla is akin to interwovenness. So even though it is a connection, there is no interwovenness without the memory of the gaps in between.
Right.
So, I think the first recording of the word Nepantla is in the interview of an indigenous man to say, where do you find yourself now after the conquest? And he says, we are Nepantla. We do not know what we are. We are both and not. We are everything and nothing, because you have replaced and shattered our ideas, but we are still those things, and we are still other things added together. So the interwovenness of those concepts in Nahuatl cosmology is going to be what's looked at there. So Anzaldúa is of course a personal favorite of mine, but it's just a Chicana cultural theorist, queer theory, feminist theory, and definitely looks at these things through a modern lens in that way, perhaps not as necessarily in like the constructionist lens or the linguistic lens necessarily, but there's something really beautiful there. I think what strikes me about conjunctio and its interrelationness to Iwori, the Ifaudu, is its relationship to, I mean, at least there are so many theories of generation of the figures outside of more specific cultural contextualization. So it's difficult to say like, oh, this one comes from this one arises from this one. But there's most agreed upon as far as Yoruba Ifa going, that it's the primal four figures being the Ogbe and Oyekun, meaning the equivalents of Via and Populace, mixed with Iwori and Odi, which are Conjunctio and Karker.
Yeah.
And that the opposite of Conjunctio is Karker. And this idea of meeting in the middle versus a container that is born through Karker of sealed at the ends, and of something in the middle that is empty, versus Conjunctio, which is open at the ends, as you described, of transient, no pointy bits, that there's something unified in the center. So this relationship between them that appears to be the mating of the day and night opposites that are Ogbe and Oyekun, or Via and Populace. This idea of how to combine these in ways that we can start to interact with, which also gives birth to the possibility, there's the P word, of all the other figures.
Yeah.
Because we have, you can go through and go from head down to feet, which some people talk about the origins of the figures in that way, and then double open or double closed up top. But this interaction on a whole level, I do find the kind of primal fire that is Iwori and its understanding of the consciousness that is then placed inside the container that was born through Karker, or through it. And so that the primal fire and water of full light and full darkness, the earth of Karker and Odi, that is ultimately the womb tomb vagitus from which we are all put forth, that the consciousness that is born through there is beyond its container, beyond Karker, and is the fire burning within that. And so there's this relationship to transformation, transubstantiation, consciousness, and therefore becomes a very difficult figure for practical everyday advice, and therefore gets relegated also to one of the quote unquote higher Odu that are not often read in New World de Lagoon, specifically for Caribbean. And so it becomes a higher number because it's one of those things where, like, practicality wise, we're talking huge concepts here.
Right.
And this bringing of things together, well, what things are being brought together? You then have to analyze it to get more practical past that.
There's a lot of association I find with Conjunctio of fast talking as well. It's if Albus is everything we do know about Mercury as a solitary and scholarly librarian or archivist, Conjunctio has that quality of the two-headed devil at the crossroads of everything we don't know about Mercury as a trickster, and certainly when it's said that whenever it crops up in relation to questions about the possibility of death, it's incredibly dangerous, right? It's that knife edge of the demimonde, and specifically that notion of like the figure itself having a kind of smooth talking, silver tongued, not necessarily deceit, but certainly taking you for a ride. And I don't know if that's similarly expressed as like just how abstract it can be and how quickly it can lead you into the middle of nowhere, right? The middest of midpoints, through trying to simultaneously juggle two or more sets of very complicated concepts.
I'm really captivated by the description of like the relationship between Conjunctio and Karker. Something that I've been thinking about a lot, some new lore that I've heard and also received in many different ways through books of talking to relatives, is this notion that quick disclaimer. There's this notion that like certain spirits will marry humans or marry places, right? And one of them, for example, is this Maya the dragon. It will marry either a place, like a location, like a forest or a particular river or a mountain, and then the things in that boundary become like them. So animals constantly live centuries or even decades, depending on the species, longer than normally would, and then they would become one of this mice, or you have them marrying people. And there's this very fascinating thing I keep coming up in interviews and in anthropological surveys and in talking to people, that like when it marries a place, that becomes kind of like a car boundary. It's contained, it's in a way considered to be transient, but also different, set apart from other nature spirits, because now the soul of that particular location is belonging and being mutated by the dragon.
It's under a mantle of some kind, right?
And then, but the people become this weird font of madness and inspiration and lust and power and so on. And they become always floating in between, because the human soul, as it becomes more and more like as they age, or because they give birth to one, it ends up becoming this weird sort of, nothing can really quite pin them down, and you're never quite sure if it's one side or the other that's talking, So just, I hear a lot in anthropological sort of like interviews with people, or even just recently a documentary I saw, people talking about, relatives who they knew were married to dragons, and they were like, it's totally different than when I hiked into that forest that also, was married to a dragon, because you have, because there, when you're walking in, when you're walking out of it, whereas the person is always flowing in between, right? They're the nexus point where the dragon is, because, if you want to petition, let's say, the dragon of Agaleraptarkimath mountain, you can just go to there, Whereas if you want to petition the dragon that's married to a person, there's all these other factors that come into play. Like, it's not as straightforward. The person can be incredibly irritable, moody about it, or the dragon can resist, or there's all these rituals that people perform, trying to cock block dragons by like dancing around someone's home and banging pots and pans and being like, stop what you're doing and go tend to the fact that our crops are dying, and stop the hail and bring in the good weather, But there's this notion that there's a danger there when it's linked to a human. Because it invites an open-ended connection into the human consciousness of their world, which causes madness and inspiration in the person, obviously. But it also means that a part of them is always sending back sort of human life to their world. And so they become this pillar of it, right? Which makes me think of just the physicality of the way that these geomantic figures are reproduced, and the way that they can be used in magic is this intensity of, and you mentioned with the Mercury figure, right? It's not quite the, the scholar that it seems kind of tame at certain points, though he never is, right? It's specifically the horned devil at the crossroads, and this trickster entity that it's the chthonic Hermes, that you're never quite sure how to pin him down, right? But it's also this, what happens when you're receiving or transmitting or being the psychopomp, right? Is something is always cutting with your feet and your head is moving in forward, and this person ends up being a nexus between two worlds that are constantly communicating in them, in the way that the forest becomes an expression of that creature on Earth. And it's this permanent location, whereas the human one, they die and they'll go right back to where they used to be.
Yeah, there seems a big like time-space thing going on here, right? I was thinking about that even in relation to like, a very simple way of relating of Karka being a lock, and the separation enforced in boundaries, and conjunctio being a key. But then I was thinking, well, no, it's more about how conjunctio is the moment, and crucially the momentum of the union of the turning key and the shifting lock, right? So one of them is bound in place across time, and one of them is bound in space through time.
The distinction between door, hinges, actual what's the name of it? The
latch.
And then the turny thingy that I'm thinking of in Serbian, not in English. Yes, thank you. Handle. The knob,
Oh, and that they have teeth and a bow. All the part. Like I was looking at a diagram of the technical terms for all the different parts of the key the other day, which just fulfilled my love of everything having its own little name.
And the force switch acts upon it, right?
What grasps it? Yeah.
What it makes me think of, I'd never considered before, of this marriage to a place versus marriage to a person, and what that brings up in this in the flavor of conjunctio versus Karka, of just the discussion of the Shekhinah as God's bride, as the force of the ineffable upon the earth, and that originally this force was contained in Eden, and it was reached through the actions of man. So in Eden, in an Edenic sense, Adam, Kadmon, and beyond, that there is this union that is happening because of containment, that the boundary is there, but it cannot truly be contained. And there is a fire of consciousness. Something happens when the man is unified with their potential for noticing good and evil, and the prison is broken. And then the Spirit of God moves from the containment of Edenic union into a force that then flows across the earth, which is eventually contained again in the Holy of Holies, or at least allows it to descend in the Holy of Holies over the Ark of the Covenant, which is the symbol of union of a people, which was also shattered, interestingly. So this union, which was then broken apart, and through the taking of that broken apartness, it becomes a token of union with God.
Yeah, a compact or a contract is so interesting in how it expresses both the qualities of conjunctio and carca. Like the coming together to do it is obviously conjunctio-ish, but like the moving forward, it having been done, that we now are bounded by it, is far more carca. And so, of course, these things are held together along the silvery riptide of mirrors that is via, right? That which invert, but links itself.
It's one of the things I've always found super fascinating about like Isaac Luria's take on Kabbalah is this notion that it's actions, specifically the actions of the chosen people, that will restore the body of God. But to do that, you got to like essentially release the sparks of light that are trapped within these shells that are broken because the original vessels could not contain it. They broke at some point as the light was descending through the spheres of the Tree of Life.
The concept there too, if you go off of the heavy discussion, especially the kind of cathodic obsession that happens in dark
LHP,
dark fluff, like a lot of things that are working off of Lurianic ideals that are been promoted. But the notion that everything is clip-off, everything a shell that has a limit, and that as far as, and I'll probably be misquoting him, and then he'll send me an email and we'll talk for another 4 hours. David Hyam Smith talking about this, that the idea that there are two trees is the true heresy. It destroys the unity and the potential to talk about a tree of life and a tree of death. The understanding that all things are shells, and that they are also not shells, because we're talking about non-dualism, which is incredibly hard to freaking deal with. But that in our understanding of things, that we can create a radiant shell, Clifanoga, right? So that's also a word for Venus, but brilliant shell. It then breaks through that shell and then exposes another shell past that. So the container is then broken by illumination. We are, through realizing the boundary, not thinking we're at the ultimate, but realizing the boundary then illuminates the next possibility, the next containment that we then do. So it is an interesting expansion past, just as if we take this Edenic force that then becomes parallel to, I'm not going to say equivalent to, the Shekhinah in the temple, that through Jesus's death, that Parakhet is rent in twain, and the Shekhinah descends across the earth. The democratization of magic, that is a myth that is heavily talked about in Quimbanda, that we've talked about with Mainloichi before. But this idea going forth again of this relationship between the pulsing outward that is only possible because of the containment inward of Karkar, that bursts forth something that is the exact complement to it, that is conjunctio, that the child is reunited or just united with their parents through the birth canal, that it bursts forth and becomes a union with the father in this lovely patriarchal metaphor. But the idea that then the bridegroom it is the facility by which the thing trapped in matter can burst forth into the waiting arms of the parent, which then brings up whole things of like the mother of sighs, mother of sorrows stuff of Levana, and the deity that is in charge of the father recognizing the legitimacy of the child by holding it aloft and naming it. But this idea of conjunctio and the fleeting nature of what that is, what is the union? And that's perhaps why it's such a difficult thing to pin down. Like, it has occurrences, but it's also, it is rare to stand in a crossroads. And when you stand in a crossroads, you become Hamlet or dead.
And I think ties back super nicely just to the marriage of place or person.
Yeah.
What it feels like to be in that crossroads, right? The thing with like Luria as well is the idea that the light will spread to the other nations, right? If people are acting in this way and liberating these things by recognizing their boundaries and by kind of upholding the laws and so on, is that other people will see the cascade of it, right? Which is funny because we talked about martyrdom and how that can sort of function a similar way. Is you get this notion that eventually the entire body of God, which is dispersed, and negotiated in both like the physical world and not, becomes unified. So it's a project to sort of like rebuild Adam Kadmon, but also recognizing that it's always instantiated everywhere.
On that kind of visual metaphor, totally love to come back to any topics multiple times, but this idea of a seed pod that bursts forth, that spreads its seeds, is our plant, is Datura.
Right.
Is this spiny vesica, this vagitus, that then rolls back and the seeds are exposed and are most often shaken down. It's not a wind-borne thing, but a large number of the plants are annuals that are going to self-seed. So it's this mother of thousands that happens. This incredibly toxic plant that is revered as a witch plant in almost every culture where it occurs, as something to be of note, that it gives strange visions or kills you, or grants shape-shifting ability, or grants you the idea of what witchcraft is in this older sense, which is, also a nod to our topic, but that it makes you lose your humanity in proximity to the plant or by ingesting it. That you exchange souls or lose souls or gain new souls in different versions of what this is, but the contextualization that there is something wholly dangerous, and I put the W there as well, not put it there, about the plant.
The devil's trumpet, the ghost flower, the sorcerer's herb.
Hell's bells.
Hell's bells.
And as lovingly innocuous as things like moonflower or Jimson weed, which comes from Jamestown, where people did not recognize the immature fruit and put it in a salad. And I think there were 11 soldiers that were throwing their shit at each other for a number of days. We're like, don't eat the Jimson weed. It's bad. Except if you're cattle and you're singing Home on the Range, which is its own thing. It has a reputation to relatives that it has between Mandrake and Belladonna and Henbane are all largely related in chemical compoundness that we're dealing with, especially when you deal with the tree daturas like Rugmansia, which are the shrubs, or not shrubs, they're woody versus herbaceous in that way.
Right, tropane alkaloids, I believe, right? With solanaceous, right?
Yes.
Yeah, which are notoriously difficult to judge dosage on, even from leaf to leaf, and also have a radically different effect on people, depending on their general tolerance, their tolerance at that time of day, that time of month, that time of year. Yes, this is why Erowid is full of accounts of people, hitting half a bong of some datura leaf and getting nothing, and others spending the next 3 days, chasing their dead relatives from crawling up their legs.
Well, it's also the very Mandrake-like comparison in that giver of so many truths, and I hope I'm not making enemies here. But Castaneda, who is a problematic figure, but in the teachings of Don Juan, details the process by which you extract the medicine of the root and the carving of the root, which it is known in several indigenous cultures in the Southwest to be much the way Mandrake would have been treated, of carving male roots versus female roots, and using it as a way to grant knowledge. So Datura having this ability to, in different areas, either make you fly or to extend your legs so that you can travel the world quickly. And the reputation with the shape-shifting type of sorcery. And it's such a plant that it appears in many forms around the world. So there's, Datura is Sanskrit. And this is its own thing that is now referred to as, the apple of Peru, the devil's apple, all these different ones. And certainly Datura stramonium being one of the very classic exemplars, but metal has its own huge groups, Anoxia, Quercifolia, and Rhydi, and these other subclassifications that have been out, and then the hybrids that come from there. It's also one of those plants that I think many burgeoning psychonauts and witch-thumbed gardeners like to grow, because it's an incredibly easy plant to grow. As long as you don't let it freeze, it can take on, it needs water, but it can still survive drought and reblossom. And it makes beautiful flowers that smell intoxicating, rightly so.
And that will, unfurl and unfurl in these like gorgeous curlings and uncurlings, and follow the moon very often as well. I consider it a great plant for working with spirits of Via as well.
Yeah, especially the night blossom ones, like moonflower.
Yeah,
so stramonium, which will bloom during the day just fine, but just the different versions of it. And then lore in Central Valley, Mexico, of crushing the seeds and using the juices of the leaves and things to help in the medicine that allows the captive victim to believe that they are the god. So the notion of sacrifice and what that means, that the idea that you are actually offering the god a version of themselves, that you make them think that they are wanting to be a martyr. And part of the way this is achieved is through topical use and ingestion of certain substances, that then the person lives as the god for 20 days and is bathed and is clothed and all these things done to it. And, I can't look into the timeline and say what the effect of this thing is in practicality, especially through outside only etic conversion standpoint of the Spaniards. But this idea that that the mythology supports that the gods sacrificed for humans to exist, and that we owe them this sacrifice in turn. But what's interesting about it is that we actually end up we mirror their sacrifice by the victim thinking that they are as God. So just in the way that the martyr re-experiences the death of Jesus in their own death, similarly, which is an example of like, why would anybody think this is necessary? That's strange. To invoke the God, the God dying, not you, and that you were granted a portion of immortality through this, is not unlike Christian martyrdom, and therefore the preservation of the skulls in the Zompantli, the skull racks that contain the destiny, the Piltlanali, the impersonal calendrical soul that is a captured piece of sunlight, is now put on display as it glorifies this collective soul that is a place, that is the city-state of Tenochtitlan for the Aztecs. But I find all of that, the stramonium, the inoxia itself, which is heavily prized, of the flower that bends its head, right? Tolohuache, I believe is the proper one, but Tolohuache is the common Mexican name for it. Comes from that word, the plant that bows its head.
And does that have similar lore to the tropes, the various things called heliotrope or selenotrope, of like that which follows the luminary?
The blossoms will go towards the source of light, but from my understanding, it's actually a reference to the seed capsules of Anoxia. So if you've grown Anoxia before, and many of the Daturas all do this, that the seed capsules, the flowers go up, and then when it forms the seed head then bows down. Of the weight of the seeds. So it is a very the fruit itself bows its head after the flower is gone.
Heavy as the crown.
Heavy is the thorn vagitus. As it should be. But yes, the heart is the clitoris of the chest after all.
Indeed.
So yeah, I think there's something interesting too. I mean, we can extend, because I think it's a separate discussion, because the lore is so prevalent for Brugmansias, which are the tree daturas, especially in their containments to the possibility of discussing other spirits in the future too, that are associated with this. But the idea that sleeping near a datura bush or a tree or under the tree makes you a witch, that there is not much more needed than that, than to be sleeping into the shade of that tree, which, when we talk about ideas of plant souls and the breaths that are exchanged and the time-space seal that happens of the dawn of a new day, of a new soul being breathed across the land by the sun, that now you have a soul that is shared with this plant. And it is an exchange of power. And therefore you are married to it in some way, and you are also have lost part of your humanity in gaining part of its soul. And this notion of this, I think, is really where I'm interested in this discussion with the two lovely of you. That was a weird way of putting that, but I respect both of your discussions we've had on this in the past, and just the possibilities of this, because the qualities of what exactly is sorcery versus witchcraft has, and as someone who identifies as witch, but still very much understands the notion and definition of witch has changed hugely in modern era. And after it has been, especially the 20th century, I don't know if we'll ever fully recover from its psychologicization and its use as the term for any outcast, which we see parallels in what we've talked about, that now any magical act is being considered magic, which I don't necessarily agree with. That just because something has a transformative effect does not mean that it was magic with intent. But any intentional act, does that make it magic, or does this dilute with the discussion of magic proper? Does then the notion of like, what does magic look like is a whole thing, because I don't want to be, personally, I don't feel the need to contain it or be elitist about it. But there are times where I find myself being like, but is that magic? Is like making tea magical? I mean, like, it does engage all the elements. I understand that from an Aristotelian point of view, but like, is that magic?
Right.
I'm really glad that you brought up the non-human aspect to it and the losing the human part and getting something else. There's a discussion I had quite recently in an AMA I was doing, because in the Serbian, especially just in general, broadly speaking, the Balkan context, a witch is something, there's a lot of terms for kinds of folk magicians, right? And sometimes I like to really go deep into these because I think the regional variations are super fascinating, especially when you look into how they differ, the utilitarian aspects of it, like what is this person doing that makes them the same as this person from this other village? How are they broadly similar, and so on and so forth. But then you get this other discussion that the fact that, witch is something few people will openly identify as. And if they, and it's a status of fear that accompanies it. It's this uncomfortable notion of like the folk magician that you ask to intercede or intervene on your behalf to talk to other spirits for you. They can also hear spirits. They can fly out their bodies. They can, do all these different things, heal and curse and bless and so on. And that's all lovely. And you can ask them to, talk to spirits on your behalf and negotiate with them. The witch is something more like the spirit that's being negotiated with. And there's always this element of apprehension around that, especially given that, a lot of the stories about it is that it's not something that can be passed on from a human to a human. And it's primarily the idea, either you're born this particular way because your parents were the lovers of particular spirits. It can be a vampire even. It can be a fairy. It can be a dragon. It can be any number of things. And then you're born with particular characteristics that represent that. The other is that, you're forcibly changed. And and I think it can be consensual. You can have someone who will like wander out into the woods and try and have this happen to them. And yes, there's certain places, especially like dragon land spirits you can sleep in. You can go out and ask the Shumnik, this like wandering hairy forest man, to change you. You can ask some of the women spirits who guard these particular whirlpools that always spin counterclockwise, and you can have them help you out and actually make you transform you into something by taking things out of you and putting things into you. But there's always this anxiety around it, that it's never going to be a safe process. Not everyone's going to survive. Even the fact that, a lot of these love stories that I love to read about and these myths, I'm always ordering more books on them and talking to people, is these dragon stories, people who fell in love with dragons or fairies, and how, amazing that is. And it's this, beautiful thing. A lot of them also go crazy, and a lot of them lose their mind and would rather not be on Earth anymore because they cannot relate to any of the humans around them. And they have it's such a struggle to realize you can't relate to the humans, but you also can't fully relate to the spirits because they don't accept you fully as one of them, but they treat you differently than the humans, and this the tearing of the soul that occurs when one of the witch mothers or one of the lords, rips your soul to shreds and puts herbs in there, puts animal parts in there, gives you new souls, takes certain parts of you away, and you come back completely dirty and raggedy, and assuming that, you've survived the ordeal, which is not always a guarantee, you are now treated as an outcast, right? God forbid you live in the same community. And if you do, you have to be very careful about it. Go to church every week. Make sure that, you don't blow your cover, right? Don't talk about it.
Keeping up appearances, that the strength that is allowed in not letting people know what you're doing.
Yes, exactly. Don't tell everyone you're a witch. Don't tell them you plan on becoming one. That can already void the contract and make it that the spirits will not even listen to you, and so on and so forth. So you get this like intense communal anxiety, but also like the tricksteriness of like, I'm going to do all my stuff under your noses. Because I wanted power that badly, and I'm going to keep my house, and I'm going to keep doing this. And you could even say, I'm not actually a witch. I'm this other thing. I would never do this other thing that I'm accused of, right? I'm this other kind of folk magician, right? But at the same time, it's this knowledge that, when you fly out of your body, it's not a human shape anymore. When your shadow looks back at you, what's looking back is not a human. And this is something that is really crucial for me, and also something as an immigrant myself, I live in Canada, was kind of weird to read about witchcraft in this kind of modern Anglo-American sense, because it becomes something that, can mean folk magic, can be anyone who's doing magic, can also mean a kind of revolutionary figure. And I again, in Europe, there's this notion that witchcraft is a rebellion, rebelling its fate, which I'm quite taken by. But it's also this becoming one of the monstrous bird/serpent/dragon people that uphold creation, the fonts of reality itself, the way that things are born. And it's a great danger, because it's the force of death and life. It's the force that takes away the cubs, when they're young, but also, comes back to slay the parents. It's intense and it's dangerous. It's a predator kind of figure, So I'm referring to some older Serbian mythology. It's pre-Christian, but gets preserved in a lot of the saint stories. So even one of the major saints who patrons witches, who I think it's Demetrius in English, but we call him, we venerate him on Mitrovdan. He is considered the Lord of the Wolves. One of his nicknames is like literally Lord of the Wolves. And you also get the notion that he's this very intense figure who is literally a witch himself, because he does not belong to either world, and yet he sustains it. It's the monster that's not a god, that is not necessarily agitating fate, but causing it to flow and to change and to flux, and that's what people are willing to lay down their lives for the chance to become, essentially, on their own levels.
That liminality again, right?
And stepping into the ability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stepping into the ability to have that relationship with fate, that it's always this testing thing. It's a rebellion, yes, but it's also being part of this class of spirits that are essentially gurgling with the way that it's potential, right?
Yes, because the notion of hybridity and conjunctio invocation there, as messianic figures, or figures that are able to be more than their constituent parts, is, you're talking about this with Demetrius, but it is also not uncommon if we take it through a Christian parallel of both being divine nature and human nature, that or the various Finno-Ugric cycles and of bear ceremonialism that I know you and I have talked about, of these hybrid bear and humans that are stellar in origin. The bears are stellar, right?
Yes.
Of heaven. And this notion that extends through many traditions in Europe, usually outside of the Indo-Europeans, but are still incorporated into much alpine lore and things like that are very interesting to me, and the way that those things survive. This notion of witch as non-human, a race apart, and the difference between that being a creature versus witchcraft, which is a crime. Mm-hmm. Notably, is a political denomination of crime that is not unlike the universal chant that is piracy. That this is the crime that everyone can be accused of and be tried locally wherever you are. Mm-hmm. Perhaps not witch anymore, but it's also one of those clashes that I see in Western treatments of the term, that imposing that upon other cultures leads to horrible misunderstandings and actually endangerment of local traditions as well. But it surprised me how much there was this article I recently shared that was talking about Hudson Valley witch houses, early Dutch settlement houses that had folk magic in the wall, in the walls, on the property, carved into things. And the author, I think it was a New York Times or the New Yorker maybe, conflated witchcraft and folk magic to the entire thing, which is not an uncommon thing in modern art. There's no distinction. And this notion that to bridge it to, I would love to poke and prod you, Al, with perhaps Discovery of Witchcraft and James I of understanding the difference between sorcerers who are human and engaging in magical acts, and the notion of witchcraft and its relationship even to invoking versus worshiping.
Totally. Yeah. So it seems like James 1/6 is drawing on an Agrippan twofold taxonomy, at least, if not as a primary source, at least drawing on other sources that are drawing on that. Yeah, sure. The idea that a witch serves the devil, and a necromancer or a nigromancer attempts to command the devil or devils, usually through divine names. And this is exactly parallel to Agrippa's twofold taxonomy that he gives, that the two main ways to practice geocy or geotic magic or goetia is either to compel the spirits by the names of their creator that they still fear, which he says is bad, but at least you're not really in league with them. And the alternative, which is, he says, giving offerings and sacrificing to them and worshipping them, which he says is like the worst of the worst of the worst. And we find, in terms of what those offerings are, a lot of the Baconian or the that which gets called the pseudo-Baconian nigromancies, the various Thesaurus spiritums, often give either animal sacrifice, or even they list effigies of animals as well, and they go into a great bunch of detail about wax lambs, which are clearly a kind of Agnus Dei kind of thing. So again, the old religion is Catholicism, but certainly imagine that
Hillary,
right? But so not only do witches serve the devil, but are potentially made somewhat differently human, I think. And again, I'm sure this will maybe upset someone. I think we find less of that inhuman quality of witches in the British Isles. Not that they aren't not that they're considered completely human, but the exchange between human and animal, or human and spirit, is specifically through the specificities of familiar law in the British Isles, has something more of suckling across species barriers and things like that, the various Dark Mother inversions, rather than the notion that the witch is entirely inhuman. There's something of a diabolism to them, something of that they're drawing on, less framed as a physical bloodline, but that the parallels are to fallen angels potentially as well. You have that lovely quote from my man John Hayden about rebellion is the sin of witchcraft, right? It's rebellion against the very natural order. He's talking about the faction of the heavenly court that scorn humans and decide to rebel against God. He's talking about the grand rebellion here, and then he goes on to say that a witch is a rebel in physics, and a rebel is a witch in politics, right? The one acts against nature, the other against order, the rule of it, but both are in league with the devil for the first father of discord and sorcery. So again, the ideas are separated so that they can then be smushed together again.
Yeah, it's also, we've talked about the inherent sexism in this too.
Oh yeah,
lends itself very well towards the fact that one might nurture the devil in the world, and therefore women who are built to nurture on the golden chain of being and the biological determinism that is Western etymology in action.
Mm-hmm.
That the simple act of breastfeeding or blood feeding through a nipple becomes the gateway through which humans can become witches or show that they are witches in this way. And,
Right.
and the apologists that happen because of the proliferation of literature that goes from the Spanish created idea of witchcraft,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically Catalonian, Pyrenean ideas of naming Cathars and Jews as anti-human, as not human, as working against the true church and its politics.
Right.
That then gets expanded upon and quickly it brought into the marriage of Spain and Germany, which was one country for a while, right? Of this idea that it spreads very quickly, this notion of witchcraft, and that these inhuman things exist. What's interesting about it is that the apologists start saying, but the women you're accusing are not witches. They're doing nothing, or they're herbalists, or they're midwives, or they're just people that you want their property. And church theologians, no less, calling people out on this, of saying this is bullshit, what's going on here.
Right.
Which then leads itself to this idea of that quote that just because you're not paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. This concept of maybe witches actually exist, because mythologically there's a lot of these ideas of night flight, not inhuman things, that their job is to be either amoral or anti-human.
Right.
Whereas the notion, or even merging into Fey lore, they can't have their babies, demons can't make babies themselves, so they need human women to do it, which plays into fallen angel watcher lore.
Right.
Or that at least that perhaps if these women weren't witches, or these men and women weren't witches, that doesn't mean they don't exist, that witches don't exist. And that by pushing these things together, we also lose the specificity of discussing them, or even through this Western obsession with renaming things, kind of invoking the patriarchal religions from which they're supposedly rebelling against. by colonizing world thought and world traditions, by conflating what they imagine is the one truth about witches and what that means into other traditions and cultures as well.
Right.
Yeah, it's something that I'm always kind of antsy around, because you get a lot of people who are like, no, these are the misunderstandings about witchcraft, and this is what it really is, or it's not this intense thing that you're describing, and it doesn't have to be this evil thing. It's always like trying to downplay the whole like apex predator thing, that metaphor I made earlier, right? Or the non-human aspects of it, and trying to redeem the things that were called witchcraft, that other people, even like you mentioned, in some case the actual heresiologists would disagree with, right? But there's this intense sort of like weirdness around. It's a kind of colonialism in its own way, right? I think, at least, because when I talk to people about witchcraft in Serbia, it's very much, not only is it real, right? People are like, don't even say it, be very careful, because it's something that, on the one hand, yes, it can be inherited hereditarily. And I love the whole Watcher lore as well, because Maias are syncretized with fallen angels. They're these stellar beings that fall for human women, sometimes men, have children with them, teach them art and magic and all these other things, and they also weirdly mutate them to be like themselves once they take them back into their world. Their gates can be around various different constellations. You have this idea that Lucifer is one of the tsars of this Maya, because he came as a serpent and seduced Eve, the first Mai bride, and they had Cain together, who was the first Maya Pejovic. You get all these interesting metaphors of like the dragon children and how Cain is their ancestor, right? But so yes, and all that's very fascinating for me. But to take away the danger that plays towards the state, towards the church, even when and admittedly, Maias are often celebrated as allies of the saints and the angels. They're not considered to be the same thing as Jdaiyas, the dragons that Saint George kills, for example, or Saint Martha and Saint Marina tame and vanquish. There's still this anxiety around it, right? That this is something that it doesn't care if you're a king, and doesn't care if you have an army. It's something that is allied to other forces, but also with what I tried to mention before about negotiating with spirits, and how the witch is kind of like one of them, essentially, right? Is that there's this overall sort of appreciation and understanding that it's not just about making offerings to the spirit and asking them to do things in return. That's usually the common way a lot of people who don't call themselves folk magicians, who don't call themselves as engaging in magic necessarily, and who don't call themselves as being like folk Orthodox, folk Eastern Orthodox, this is just what they think is Orthodox, Christianity. That it also includes leaving offerings out for these land spirits and making sure that your crops don't get screwed over by the poludnica, which Troy and I love to talk about.
Around something we've talked about recently too.
Yeah, but in general, like what I'm getting at too is that this is not considered to be necessarily always magic. Even though anthropologists will come in and be like, oh, you're doing magic. And they'll be like, no, hold on. No, this is just this thing, But for witchcraft, it's very much considered to be, it's that force, right? It struggles on the pulse of life, but it also makes it go quicker, You be very careful when you manipulate it, right? It's the danger of working with the serpents in the land, right? Because what happens if an earthquake occurs, or suddenly this place is tainted forever because of some evil thing you've done there, It's this, strain of people who willingly choose to, again, there's a danger in not surviving initiations if there are initiations involved, It's the strain of, they could go out and do that and come back, and now they have to hide it, and they have to be smart about it, but they also can be lost in the unfamiliar of the world, because something becomes familiar to them in a completely different way. It's a totally different way of seeing the world and relating to other spirits, to the point where, and this is what I wanted to kind of get to, is that for like people who are considered folk magicians or sorcerers in the Balkans, to my understanding, of course, given the areas I'm from, you can fear them because of the spirit allies that they have and the powers that they have because of them, right? But a witch is feared, the spirits will fear her because of what she is as well. So she can intimidate other spirits with fear because of what she represents and how her relationship with the world is.
To revisit something that you hinted at that I know you talked about, because it's worth making enemies over, this concept of folk Orthodox or folk Catholic. I identify as folk Catholic, but not because of, there's a trend that's evolving of people that were never raised Catholic and never Catholic to begin with that are saying that they're folk Catholic, to which my answer is Catholic, and then there's folk Catholic, which is a set of practices and styles of operating within a Catholic paradigm and framework that is described as folk Catholic as perhaps an anthropological nod to the fact that you are not in agreement with the papal seat of Rome's idea of what catechism is. And so it's what is folk Catholicism? It's Catholicism practiced in a non-standard way, which the standard of that is like, how are you a Catholic? Well, there's 8 holy days of observation. There's going to church on Sundays. There's the sacraments of baptism, confirmation, confession. And going from there, the Catholicism as a culture is a culture. You are, the nature of a culture is that you must be raised within it or suddenly transplant yourself to be raised by it. And the notion of learning this from books, which is inherently anti-Catholic, interestingly, to be so developed that it's only coming from books, that the practice that this doesn't make sense, because the Catholicism is nothing without its universalism, where the book is a figure within it. The authority of the written word and of the papal bullshit are markers of Catholicism. But that, like, in throughout the world, these practices that are done, it is folk magic that is done in a Catholic universe, or folk magic that is done in an Orthodox universe. Therefore, it is not necessarily possible to be a convert to folk Catholicism or suddenly start practicing folk Catholicism. You're practicing folk Catholic magic, perhaps, but you are not necessarily a folk Catholic. That many of us, I know, have used the term to describe our practices, because what are you going to say when I want to offer blood sacrifice to a saint? And what is this? And what are the Iberian practices there that influence those ideas that are hybridizations from Muslim and heretical practices that are not acknowledged by the church as proper Catholic anymore? But this notion of folk is an interesting thing, because oftentimes what it means is now it feels almost like a core shamanism argument that, like, I want to do whatever the fuck I want and I still want to have Jesus in it, so I'm going to call it folk Catholicism, as opposed to a culturally contextualized understanding of a paradigm, its needs to keep the people sustained, and people's practice and engagement with a universe that is ultimately Catholic, because that is the political description and naming power of authority in the land itself. My rant against this can even be traced back to, like, the Cyprianic reemergence that happens. And I say reemergence because the West may have had a Cyprian obsession the way that Latin America has seemingly had one for 400 years, or Eastern Orthodox areas have had one for continuously. That the Anglophonic rediscovery of a tradition, again, this Anglophonic Western mentality that when you discover something like, I don't know, 2 continents, that somehow it's new. And embracing the term New World, which I will backtrack and say my modern distaste in using the word Anglophonic is a modern parallel to that. I understand that it was an Italian that was in the name of the Spanish crown that came here and named 2 continents in the name of the New World. But that was just because he was an idiot and thought he was somewhere else. That said, it's an interesting parallel to all of this and how complicated it is for those people whose practices are being mined for information. And it's hard, as someone who loves 90s chaos magic and understands that a witch seizes power wherever they can. Not necessarily the witches that steal the baby souls and things like that, but like more conglomerate ideas or modernized versions of witchcraft. But that a magician or someone will see power and try to take it. But also, what is the responsibility when you call yourself something like folk Catholic, that you are not familiar with Catholicism on that level? That somehow, never having sat through masses in that way, that suddenly it's weird to me. And it's weird because the Catholic elitist in me wants to bare its teeth, which is not necessarily what I want to represent, or am I even about? So I have to check that of what is it? What is this need to, like, if you ask some of the women that I trained with as their curanderas, I call them curanderas. They would not refer to themselves as curanderas, because why? That is a title that is earned and a reputation because you healed people or brought people back from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Not because you were putting it on a business card, not because you took a class, not because you suddenly have an interest that you're suddenly a curandera. And furthermore, the only time that they might say that they were a curandera was when someone accused them of being a bruja, of being because this would get you stapled inside your house and set on fire.
Mm-hmm.
In regional areas, up until the Llewellyn injection of the 1990s idea of Western Wicca and witchcraft and neo-paganism that demanded that the entire world bow to the published account of Western white ideas of what witchcraft is post-1950s Wicca.
Precisely. And that's what I meant by it's a kind of colonialism.
Yes.
And it's and the reason I even bring it up is because talking about witch and sorcerer and folk magician, right? The whole like hiding it, not showing that you're that, masquerading as a folk magician. But even so, like a lot of these things are very much like if you have a problem physically, you go to this woman who will heal you, right? And she doesn't have that reputation for nothing, whether it's spirit alliances or just the history of her healing. It's in a way that it's the craft part of witchcraft. It's like if I need something made for me, I'll go to the silversmith. If I need this done, I'll go to this person who specializes in this craft, right? So it's a title that's earned over time because the person has consistently been able to perform a particular service for the community and living in that community. In this case, in Serbia, especially Eastern Orthodox, it's the assumed worldview, the way that like the mentality that dominates everyone is this kind of Christianity, right? With saints and with relics, with icons, and with these particular, with the feast days, and I'm thinking a lot about the Zadoshnice recently. These are like the 4 Days of the Dead across the year. Recently, we had Mitrovske Zadoshnice, which are the most important ones. It's usually November 2nd. It's the Saturday before Mitrovdan, which is December 8th. And you have, people burying animals alive in graves with people in order to do certain things. You can have them offering žito or koljevo, these sort of grain cakes, drizzled in beeswax candles to the dead to placate them. And you have all these different things that can occur. And when I talk about this with people, especially people here, they'll be like, oh, well, what's so Christian about the animal sacrifice part? What's so Christian about the whole watching butterflies come out of graves to see who's a vampire, or leading a black horse over graves to see if anyone accidentally became a vampire when you weren't looking, and it's just like, well, it makes perfect sense in the Orthodox mentality. And so I don't, we, in our own like discourse of anthropology, it's in Eastern Europe, it's often called like dvonoveri, like two faith or double faith, as like the answer to folk Catholicism, or, but even so, no one calls themselves that, right? No one in there will identify as that. It's useful knowing how to talk about on like the meta scholarly level, to discuss, how these people who think that they're totally right with the church, and even their church often in the villages will be like, oh, I can't solve this problem, and neither can the saint. Maybe you should go to this woman who happens to, her husband's a werewolf, or she's married to a dragon, and she can fix your problem.
Right.
It's this interaction. It's like, okay, if we can't fix it, someone else will. There's a communion of powers who can intercede, and they're present, and they're real, and they're part of the social makeup of the society of the village. Totally, But on the other hand, too, is this notion that no one thinks they're a heretic, until people come in and accuse them of it, right? And so, and even then, it's like, no. I'm not doing magic. I'm doing healing with this saint, and not mentioning that you also see him as a lycanthrope, who rides through the night with a horde of wolves who may be your ancestors that have to be punished because they weren't, such and such, and they ended up making bargains for things, and now they follow him in the train of wolves for back to trains and riding on coattails, and you have to offer them the first lamb of the season, otherwise they'll come after you, and so on. But it's this idea, it's like needing to hide these practices, now you can put on business cards, but even said in a lot of these communities, it's like, it's such a taboo because it's layers and layers of meaning and myth that can compacted in these instances of these ritual actions of power. And everyone thinks they're just proper Christians, even when they completely talk about older pagan god names.
Yeah.
Where they talk about spirits that are not originally, and this is the whole thing with syncretism, right? Spirits that are not originally considered to be Christian now are Christian, and that's imposed on them, and they have to live with that change.
Is comparable. It's not always the case, but syncretism is, well, let's take its definition, is the exertion of a dominant cultural influence upon a lesser cultural influence, and the combination or the subjugation by the dominant for the lesser. And this, in some ways, and I think accurately by many people, has been compared to rape and the children of rape. That there is this force that comes in and completely obliterates through disease, through conquering, through language shift. All these things happen at once. And the idea of masking, which is a very common thing in magic, of like, we mask as good citizens, whether you are or not, because that's how you want to get along. And I don't mean we in the sense that I'm not going to say that I'm let's leave me out of this, but this idea at the same time of, I make this argument in this way all the time, like perhaps maybe you walk around your own house naked, and that's good because you like being naked. You like to feel the wind beneath your labia and your wings and all these things. But if you walk out in the street in that way, there's an understanding that social contract will make you get arrested, because that is not everything somebody agrees upon in society. So there's this contract that gains you power to not be arrested. And this embracing of social contract, keeping up appearances, keeping up with the Kardashians, whatever the fuck we're calling it, is a way in which to gain power as well. Social contract is a way to gain power. It does not mean that it is just a prison. Similarly, engaging in the dominant worldview can be an act of complacence, an act of protection and survival at first. But the children of those things, when you get to first the pigeon and then the creolization, if we're going to use language metaphor, that is often used in hybridization talk, not just plant baby hybridizations, but to talk about what it means for the children of the people that first encountered this wave of conquest that comes in and changes idea. Whether that's a new scientific discovery that takes a couple years to kind of go back on. I just saw this article with rosemary is no longer its own genus. Rosemary is now officially salvia.
Mhm.
It's Salvia rosmarinus now. It's no longer Rosmarinus officinalis. This is going to fuck with people. But like the British gardens are already starting to change it because we're scientifically, there's not enough distinction between the genuses, Gina, something to be distinct. And or Pluto not being a planet, that sometimes you just got to wait for people to die out. that they're grasping onto it with their little dragon witch claws, like what that is. And similarly, I find these notions of all of these things so complex that like we can get into semantic battle of is there such a thing as folk Catholicism versus folk Catholics? Or are you practicing folk Catholicism? Or is it folk like that gets into semantics. So I want to avoid that trap because my brain will justify it either way because that's what I like to do. But the notion ultimately that a folk Catholic doesn't know they're folk Catholic is an extreme point of privilege for me to be able to label myself as such, based on trying to justify myself and my practices over the years to occultists who will say there's no such thing as Christian witchcraft. It was like, in the West, there's technically only Christian witchcraft.
Right.
The language problems there, but that's a whole other discussion there. But the idea that this reclamation of a pagan witchcraft past complicates things, but then we also have to let go of the fact that this proclamation that Christianity prohibits magic in that way, which is not necessarily true. In fact, we know that, or this show wouldn't exist as far as saints being interwoven into demons and plants and yes, out of jobs that we created for ourselves that don't pay us anything else. But yeah, sorry, it's I've talked about this a lot with both of you individually and I think together, and it's one of those things that I want to move away from saying Scrooge McDucking it and being like, get off my lawn, it's because people are just going to say, okay, boomer to me. But at the same time, there's something that should be embraced here of the point of privilege of calling yourself a folk Catholic and being able to label yourself that when the practices that are being talked about are just Catholic body of lore and magic that we are attributing as folk Catholic. So it's this interesting thing of like, even the concept of witchcraft, that these things that are called witchcraft that are in the trial records as witchcraft, if we go into like Isabel Gowdy and as we were talking about, like we're listening to about me, I was listening to you talk about this and many other things at the Cornwall conference this year. Isabel Gowdy's transcript is where a lot of our ideas of witchcraft come from, especially as promulgated by Wicca, the numbers of people in a coven and how that operates and these things like this, which has colored our entire idea, which then we Mandela effect and go back and put upon all of history and say that it must be this. It's like a Murrayist fallacy gone crazy. And I mean, I would love Murray to be real, but she's not. There's no historical evidence for it. Changed my mind. Perhaps over a Datura tea.
Well, I think most obviously as well, to echo your point, like we're back to that notion of talking over the people that you're purportedly wanting to learn from, right? The more we muddy the waters with taking on labels or titles or practices devoid from their cultural, social, political, economic contexts, the more we flatline potentially, and the more difficult it becomes to actually preserve and celebrate these traditions very often.
I think it reminds me of the tendency of when one has little knowledge, one defends little knowledge with great zeal. And I think it's a pattern that we all have experienced on and perhaps participated in, that when you learn to label something or start to explore something, that you want to see that thing everywhere. And so it is, I understand the tendency, but also the people who might know a little bit about a specific set of folk magic that then go online and poo-poo the things that don't fit into their idea of what that mold is, that then don't allow for a polyvalent existence of what that practice is. And Katarina, you and I have talked about this quite a bit with an understanding of a tradition that I think there is some in me personally, I would theorize that there might be something into it with this kind of monotheistic tendency of being the one right way, that somehow right belief is the thing, and that you're from Serbia. Great. Serbia, I want you to tell me, is it like, I heard about this other practice, and you would be like, I mean, that has nothing to do with anything. No, but sure, that's not, it could be, it's in Afro-diasporic traditions, there could be a temple on one side of the street in Brazil that practices a specific way of doing candomblé, and it could be the same nation that and the same lineage, but the temple across the street does things differently. Why? A different temple.
Exactly.
And that diversity of practice is actually a sign of a thriving ecology of spirit very often, right?
Yes.
I brought up like the whole different like names that are used or regional variants for the same practice, right? Sometimes I read German ethnographers going into Serbia talking about these things, right? And they're like, oh, these are different forms of the same thing, or like these are completely different practices, right? Which, we can debate the etymology of aspect of it, but at the end of the day, like, what are they doing and how are they doing it and how did they get there? So like even like Balkans is a huge, part of the map, but Serbia itself, changing borders and all, like the villages will do things very differently from each other, especially given that the fact they're sprawling and they're not actually centered around a main square. And then two is like, when you marry into someone else's family, you suddenly discover like they've been doing the whole Mitrevska Zadošnica festival completely differently. And there tends not to be an anxiety around it in the same way, because there's this recognition that things are just happening differently in other places, right? So on the other hand, it's not like even the words "mai" is interpreted differently in different places, right? Which is great, because that means that people are interacting with this differently. It doesn't mean that they're right and I'm wrong, or I'm wrong and I'm right and they're wrong. It's not a question of being right necessarily, right? Or like, because my biggest issue with this is what happens when, and I love books. I'm in university. I'm in a PhD program. I like to write. But when you put things in a book, it in a way becomes sacred in a different way. Where it's like you come into. I remember reading Stefania Capone's book on candomblé, right? So what happens when people want to initiate into one particular temple, and they're like, wait a second, this ethnographer did this, research here, and you guys aren't doing it the way that he wrote about it. So is it real? I want to go to this other temple where they do it this way, and it's this anxiety of like what happens when something gets put into a book and now that's the way things are. I try and insist so much that, oral lore is this precious thing that it's going to change. It's going to be different. I can only offer my perspective, my experience of my family, the village that I'm from, and the people around it and the people I've spoken to, right? And it's great to cross-reference and so on, but there's a reason these things are living. The whole like point we made about, you don't know your folk Catholic or Orthodox or whatever, people are living these things. You can it's not this like sort of sabbat or esbat that you plan for months in advance and then you make it this one thing and you follow a script. It can be very organic, and people live with the consequences of that in their village because they're not leaving the area, and it's permeating through the culture in a way that when you come in and you want to have the title of a tradition and you want to, put it on, I don't know, like your Instagram, description, and you want to say this is what I do and this is what I practice. It's just like, well, maybe you should go and talk among these people that you're, valuing in this way and see what their opinions are before you start making this to, what that really means for you because you read a few books.
Right, for sure. There is a very different relationality to authenticity when you're like, we're on the land, like we're doing the thing that people have been doing here for a very long time. It's not so important to us, or we may have a very different reason why, our ribbons are green and blue rather than green and red, right? There's a very different notion of, what's authentic practice that when it's taken out of its context, right? That the adherence to a set of checklists from an anthropologist becomes forefronted, perhaps even overemphasized, right? Because you're desperately trying to do the thing outside of understanding the wider or the deeper roots that have nourished it.
Two things that makes me jot down. One, building on that candomblé idea you're talking about, it was famous for years that Mayra Padre Santo would not show another devotee inside their temple that wasn't from the temple, but they would show an anthropologist because that meant that it would be documented and minimize their own temple. Yeah, this parallel notion of the ossuary effect, as it's lovingly referred to by of that, going in and documenting voodoo in Port-au-Prince in the 20s in Haiti, and documenting the ossuary tradition, which was a minority tradition by accounts, and that after that point, after the publishing of this, that everyone had to get ossuary. And you had to say you were an ossuary lineage, or at least go get it and exchange traditions with people that were in an ossuary lineage because you were Chacha and you were doing things differently. And this notion that, again, you've got to keep up with the Joneses. And this happens constantly in Brazil, whether it's Quimbanda, Umbanda, Cachimbo, Batuque, Candomblé, the different versions of what these things are, Santo Daime, of you got to appear as the most common on-trend thing if you want to get butts in the seat. Now, if you don't want to get butts in the seat, you can do whatever the hell you want. So there's this notion of nosa, our way of doing things. But it also, I have a question for the two of you, just so that I can let you defend it, of what is the relationship between wanting to accept polyvalent approach as natural, as the normal way of the universe, and then wanting to call people out on saying things like, that they practice something that is like, but this, you just created something out of whole cloth. That lacks context within that. What is the relationship between those things, and how are we not just the hypocrites we normally are by talking about these things both at the same time?
Burning
in hell.
The perennial tension, I think, in this, because on the one hand, like, I'm very fond of seeing how things develop, right? And despite, yes, a lot of these things that I mentioned, some of this folklore is definitely pre-Christian. The more I talk with Jesse, the more I realize it's pre this region even. But it's at the same time it is now syncretized. There's these new changes that have come. We interpret them. The whole mention of the Orthodox worldview or the Christian worldview, like everything, dragons are Christian now.
Same as the old boss type of thing.
Yeah. And so everyone is interpreting in this kind of economy and the social reality of these spirits, So that's one thing. On the other hand is, there's what's misinterpretation because of inexperience and only book reading. I read these 10 books on traditional witchcraft in scare quotes that someone recommended to me on a blog post, and now I'm a witch, versus, doing what we were talking. So, because honestly, I really relate to what you mentioned about the chaos magic thing. I want to live and let live very much, but at the same time, it's this tension of wanting to defend my snobbishness, I guess, around this idea. So I think that, on the one hand,
we're all just snobs in a hot tub.
We are, yeah. I think there is something really to the idea of being aware of the cultural context of things, because the culture will change, right? By definition, it will evolve, and it'll take on new things with migrant groups, with new attitudes, with new books that come in. The way that the landscape of what magic is understood to be in city centers like Belgrade in Serbia has changed a lot because of Thelema, Golden Dawn. These things being translated, but at the same,
even pronounce a Latin J as an actual J.
Has this just been eating you up inside, like how I've been pronouncing it for as long as we've known each other?
Actually, we rarely pronounce the figures' names.
That's true. That's true, yeah.
They flash me a hand sign and I'm seeing their counting things. And because I like referring to them in English, I think this is a wonderful practice too, precisely because of those things too, of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and just being like, fuck it, conjunction or congress or whatever these things are, holy conflation. And because I don't pronounce my name Yesi unless I'm speaking in Spanish. So, it's all in jest, but it's a good one because it makes me happy to get our hackles raised.
But that's the thing. I think there really is something to be gained and showing up to these places that, you're interested in, and actually seeing what it's about. People practicing a witchcraft of a place they've never been to, or saying that they do. I think it's an importance, right?
Sephiroth of Wales or
Cornwall. Yes, thank you.
Right.
So I think it's with this Quimbanda house, showing up at your house and learning it, versus as lovely as it is reading, books or practicing information that you've taken home. I think there's something really essential that I feel clicking when I'm being introduced to a culture and a worldview that's quite different, and seeing how it operates in the little moments. It doesn't seem too esoteric, right? It like the fact that, a lot of this folk Christianity stuff doesn't seem like it's this spooky magic, and when you're there, right, it's like, wait a second, this woman was just, washing this pot and muttering this thing. Well, what was that, and like, you really have to, I just think it's so essential to, you can be changed too, right? You can be molded by a culture that you become adopted by, and so it's important to be
a
there.
Real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think taking on of a cultural practice or a culturally embedded practice, which in truth, most things are. And if you don't know what culture your practice is embedded in, then look closer. It probably means that it just isn't too different from modern atheistic, materialistic, Western psychological framework that most modern magic finds itself in.
Mm-hmm.
It evokes automatically to me the tarot trump that we have selected for the day, which is the Hangman.
Mm-hmm.
State of liminality of if it does go towards Odin and the gaining knowledge by suspending yourself in neither this nor that, the notion of hybridity and the divine man, divine bear, the divine god, divine man, like this what this is, the nature of these things that is both to be both human and not human, and then the notion of betrayal that is invoked by the Hangman, of it being Judas as well.
Right.
It's interesting thing of like, what did you do for this, and what does it mean in this judific act of are you the most devout believer? Like, are you, is it this kind of neo-Gnostic interpretation that Judas is actually Jesus's man that was chosen for the job to go down in infamy, but make sure that the martyrdom happened? Or is it actual betrayal? Or is it, what is it? These different things are there. And then even the notion of the St. Peter was crucified upside down because he could not be, he said he was not worthy to be killed as Jesus was. So I don't know. It's interesting there, right?
No, Jesse, that's the inverted cross of the cliff off.
It's true, but really it shows that it's the reflection, right? Because he's still upside down. Human beings don't walk on their heads usually, unless I went to college with you, in which case we might have had a class or two together. Yeah, I mean, the Hangman is or the idea of the condemned man and what this means, or the plant that bows its head. There's a nature of change, perhaps.
Well, taking the gestation and birth analogies with Conjunctio and Karka, right? Seeing the hanged man upside down as the bebe, right? All amniotic, right? That and this is backed up by by some Hebrew letter attributations.
By truth.
It be by truth, yeah, by the truth that some people say that it's because it's associated with Mem, the letter of primal water, obviously the term for a mom in a more familial context, and that that which is like eternally dreaming, right? The being that is not quite yet, that is nascent, that is forming, that is collecting the runes of a consciousness to be able to like understand the world when it emerges and is pushed out.
Mm-hmm. Something that just came to me, because this is one of the threads that we've been following, right? Is what is your eye that you're giving up for the runes? What is the witch or the would-be witch sacrificing?
How do we sacrifice to ourselves? Yeah,
to ourselves in order to gain this, and the pieces of you that you are losing forever, the parts of you that make you human, that you are losing. Or even like in the case of the marriages, what are you losing because of this immense pact that you take on that dominates the rest of your life and makes you into a weird social creep, that is now making you just kind of off-putting and strange in all these different ways, even to other people who use magic, And then the fact is like the potential for madness there, the potential for great illumination, and the fact that, there are erotic elements to it that make you like transcend certain states, but then also make every return to the body when you fall back into your skin more alien and sometimes more repulsive. It's what is the sacrifice? And I think when we're talking about, adoption and cultural legacies and what does it mean to really take on a tradition that you weren't raised in, or, I think one thing we can think about is the sacrifice that is being made, because there always is. And the honesty of kind of confronting that, in terms of like, what are you willing to take on? And also, as opposed to a title, and
Right.
and a few dollars sent to Amazon to buy some books so you can cite them in groups and be all
and a sense that however well you learn the languages and sacrifice, that there will always be a sense that you are somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel that as an immigrant, frankly, like, the way that I speak Serbian now, it's a little bit different than the way that people speak it back home, even though it is fluent, and just like the weird code switching that occurs in not totally noticed. Should I be polite in Canadian or polite in Slavic? But immigration is an adoption too, right? So it's just that thing that I'm thinking of is like the sacrifice that is made. What is lost, right? Something is lost, but what is gained?
Well,
yeah. Do the Canadian government have any of your blood?
No comment.
Okay.
Smeared across the Capitol building. But I love this metaphor of immigration in this way, because I think one of the things that is given up when you go into a culturally embedded tradition that you are not born to, or even if it's in your own culture, but you didn't necessarily grow up with that tradition, which is its own thing. And there are different levels there of the kind of gradual the sudden loss of identity and security in what your identity and stability is will be evident. So you can be, I see this all the time in friends who are coming into, let's say, Lukumi, and they are practicing magicians in something else, and they are extremely knowledgeable, experts in their field of an academic subject or whatever it is, but you come into a culturally embedded tradition like this, which is heavily oral, even though there's lots of things written, they have to completely accept that they are coming in from the viewpoints of elders that have 80 years of practice of the tradition and living it, that they are nobody. Mm-hmm. And that shift is extremely hard for people, as it should be, because the first few times you do it, it's just like, wait, what do you mean? Like, I've spent my whole life on this identity, this loss of identity that comes in, which is necessary for growth. It's the whole thing of no wine can be added to a cup that's already full. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an interesting metaphor in that way, that immigration wise, this notion of, is there a possibility for dual citizenship? Is there not? Is there this idea that you have to prove that you're not going to be a burden upon the group that you're coming into? Are you going to contribute to the group you're trying to join, not just gain the benefits of being there? Mm-hmm. That notion of it is often forgot when coming into a tradition. What do I bring to it? What can I do for it? That side of it, it's a fascinating metaphor to explore, with the whole process too of like being judged and being told that you're worthy of being in the group as well, which happens with a lot of notions across the board of do you speak the language? Do you have a job? Are you productive? Did you come here for marriage? And did you really marry the person so that you could get into the country, or did you marry them out of love? In which case, why didn't they go to your country? And what's that whole process that goes with that takes away and eats away its stability, of which ego is a natural fighter form.
Huge thing in my family, when you come over with a PhD, that's not recognized, right?
Yes.
Not the right university, never mind, you can't be this thing anymore. Go find a different job.
And you might be lucky and find someone or a group that can help guide you in and at least advocate and discuss your expertise, background, and knowledge and help you go in that way. Or you might find someone that doesn't care at all, in which case you have to met that somehow. You have to, that friction is unique to every person coming into a tradition.
Yeah, and speaking to sort of the thing we were mentioning with like folk Christianity and so on, right? Is this notion of, if it's not the culture you were raised in, why not begin by going to church, and seeing what it's like to take confession, for the first time, or learn these songs and learn the movements behind it and learn what happens afterwards and before, all these protocols and so on, because and also what are you bringing to it, right? I think it's an interesting question to always keep in mind when looking at these things, because, I am so fascinated by so many different things, and I'm so privileged to be learning things that are completely outside of my cultural view and expertise, but I'm also like relearning things from my own culture by talking to people from a quarter of the country that I had never been to, even though it's not a long drive, or in the dialects that they speak that are different, and the way they conceive of fairies, for example, or, like, for example, like learning that there are possessions that are regular and can be scheduled by fairies in certain parts of Eastern Serbia, and the falling women, and the little Pejovic, as they're called, it's like, well, I didn't know that existed until very recently. Now it's like, okay, well, aren't you from that culture? It's like, I'm not from that part of the country, so it's constant negotiation, right, is that one thing I stress is, it will sell books and it'll be nice, on resumes and so on to be like, yeah, I'm talking about this region, which is totally true, right? And it can have its own things, but then like you may not be aware of what the village over is doing, you may not be aware of the nuances behind it. And it's lovely, but it's this constant, like, it's never quite stable. And I'm very fascinated by the instability of it, the fire that the tests and provokes, pokes at you wherever you go, to realize like you're not as firm in your knowledge as you thought you were, but it's a good thing because you're always learning and growing. And I think that people should kind of, at least I hope to, take that into account when looking at things that are foreign, and realizing that, yes, Christianity is this massive force that dominates so many parts of the world. But like, Catholicism and Orthodoxy, those things are like, are a culture. They're not just a book that you read, and as a result, it's necessary to engage with on its own terms. No matter what your background is. And even if, a few generations before, someone in your family was from one of these cultures, it doesn't guarantee that you necessarily always know everything from it, right? Like I'm sure, like I meet friends who, are third or fourth generation, Serbian, and they know a lot of things, but like they learn about these things through reading books in English, right? Which is a very different, and then they think that like, this term that I'm using for this kind of folk magician is a universal throughout the country, but it really only accounts for like these 3 villages in Northwest. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of those things. I think we may have mentioned this with Stegaria, right?
Yep.
It's just this like relearning of things, but on its own terms.
You remind me of, and jumping off things earlier, like the many discussions about, and the writings are brilliant, and she's a really lovely person, but Gemma Gary at no point says that it's an extant Cornish tradition, but many Americans treat it as if it is. Mm-hmm. And it evokes the notion that you've talked about, Al, of the Sphirot of Wales, or
the Isle of Kent.
Yeah, that you're like, yo, I can drive there. It's just down the road from me, and it's still full of sheep and miners. So where is this like utopian witch village that you're saying that all these witches exist in, that you can just walk down the street and be initiated into something? Mm-hmm. Fantastical validation of self-perceptions of identity is nothing new to anything, let alone witchcraft and the magical tradition.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Speaking on that, I guess as a segue, I'll find some way to segue back to the demon, but the Witch of Endor, I think, is this interesting side of it too, that, in building off of this idea of going to someone, but not necessarily wanting to, you go to them as a last resort, as they are outside the norm or the structure of the stability of the universe as you might know them. And so the Witch of Endor being this, and despite my wish for her to be an Ewok, this is indeed to summon when Saul, interesting because we were talking about Paul earlier, but right. We're dealing with the idea of summoning the shade of the prophet Samuel to tell him what to do. And it's first book of Samuel, I believe. The battle with the Philistines is going poorly, and his attempt to cast lots had already failed, and to talk to other prophets the living prophets had failed.
The Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so this need to go to the witch comes in. And this is the thing of like, there we can debate like what exactly this word is that's used for witch, because it certainly has been heavily talked about.
Right. By the King James version, it's a woman that hath a familiar spirit, interestingly. Or at least in English. Yeah.
And most theaters like of this kind were already driven out of Israel.
Yes.
So it's like, where do we find this person who can do it? It has to, Saul does it in disguise.
That she is the woman who possesses an Ob at Endor.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that Ob might be translated as familiar. It might be translated to a pit, that she has a necromancy pit, which is fascinating. And please, just like, if this is historical, please build the time machine that I can go back and see what she's doing.
Well, there's the notions that it's ventriloquism as well, right? Or related to speaking from the stomach.
Yes.
Right? There's that great article, I can't remember who it's by, on exactly that, right? Voices coming from different places, or something around, listening to one's gut feeling. This with so close to the specificity of what that was, to the writers, and yet so far from what that might mean.
Yeah, it reminds me of a couple of things. One, like sign puppetry, right, of the doll speaking for you, but also the false unicorn horn in the Last Unicorn, that people don't recognize what's real. They might not be able to hear the disincarnate voices, so you have to give the voice. Like, what is it to be channeling something it's for an entity that no one else can hear?
Yeah.
So you end up having to speak with a voice that is different, or put on a show, even if accurate already. That even if it's true, the communication is there in our various endorsements of our own realities. But that side of it is always interesting to me with her. And also that Saul goes to her in disguise reminds me heavily of Odin going to the seeress in disguising his image to ask if basically the events of Ragnarok can be avoided.
Right.
And tests her with knowledge first, or like, who are the funeral pyres for? And she knows damn well who it is. And then she figures it out, like, oh, you are no way tamer. Like you are Strider, you are Odin, and you are mother of monsters. Noting her identity and referencing these things of like, you are not just the shade of a woman either, that just because I'm seeking the ghost within the hill that gives answers, and this reference kind of Utiseta of sitting on the hill and calling the ghosts up as you sit on that all night through the trials and tribulations of the long night, especially in an area where there might not be daylight for 23 hours. But within the Witch of Endor context of just this, I don't know, it's always held fascination with me of like, just in biblical literature classes as a child, of like, what do you mean? How do you see the Elohim arising, for instance? Like, what does that mean? What is this of the Latin Vulgate, I believe, is snake pit, that it's translated as. So it brings up this whole fascination for me of like comparing her to Eryxo and like pseudo Medusa-esque contemporary pagan stuff that was going on at the time for Saint Jerome.
Yeah, I mean, the serpent stuff is stuff that Agrippa raises as well when he's talking about the Witch of Endor and whether or not it's Samuel or not. And he says, there are plenty of Hebrew masters that say that it might actually have been Samuel. They don't necessarily dispute that. But he starts talking about when flesh is left as meat for serpents, right? And that they call to it, and they call it. He brings up Azazel, who he calls the Lord of Flesh and Blood, and the Prince of this world, which I'm especially interested in terms of Azazel's links to pulling up dead magicians or dead important people, dead advisors, dead tutelary shades, because that's
dead magicians' comments.
That's exactly what we get later on in the excellent book. Is Azazel is the first authority.
I'm really glad that's moving forward. And if you don't know about it, please go visit Scarlet Imprint because the pre-orders will be up within the month. And I'm really excited for you, Al, and everything that's going on.
It's so exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Elohim arising is super cool too, like the plural verb. Yeah. It's plural, right? So it's like, what does that even mean in this context? And I love that one of the things that's always fascinating about the story is that she's the last resort, right? And like what I mentioned before with like, like the witch, at least in the context I'm familiar with, is really the last resort. Like you'd rather go to the priest, and then if you can't go to the priest, you go to your healer. If you can't go to the healer, you go to like this person who was creepy and born with a caul that flies out their body on Thursdays or on holy days to do literally like fist fight weather demons. It's very Mortal Kombat. And then they come back and they're bruised and tired. And his wife's been swinging a scythe over him for the last 4 hours, praying that no one else tries to take his body while he's gone. All this other stuff. It's great. And then finally, like, God, if you happen to know who among you is one, and there's always an anxiety, is like, is any one of us is? It's like, who is it? It's like, it's like when you're bargaining with her, you're bargaining with the spirits, in an unmediated sense, and there's always a risk that, she doesn't like you, she can just put you down herself, and that's just, even though the others, again, have powers too. It's just that this is the nature of like what it is versus, who they have contracts with and what they sacrifice to get that.
Yeah, less about what the church allows or doesn't allow, or what a good Christian does or doesn't do, and a lot more about, again, desperation. Who do you go to when a thing needs doing? And that fascinates me in terms of how many accounts there are of cunning folk butting up against the law and the changing laws of the various witchcraft acts that come in. The instance of someone, I think, being a criminal being declared fled from jail by the sheriffs, and a cunning man turns up to the sheriff's office saying, I'll do magic to help find him and bring him back. And they have to tell this cunning man that, like, that's illegal now, and has been for many, many years. And they kind of have to put him in jail about that,
And that's
which they work out. But that idea that you go to the expert you need, not the one that necessarily fits your nice, neat policy.
Yeah, and like that's really fascinating that you brought that up, because like we have examples of people like Kristniks, for example, or Stuhashi, who I mentioned, Callborn, they fly out their body, they fight weather spirits. The weather spirits then become like the evil ones are then considered to be witches, and like that's like the rival sorcerer from the village over, and you're trying to steal his fertility, and it becomes this thing. It's like, no, I'm not a witch. I'm the witch hunter. I'm the witch fighter, because I leave my body while she leaves her body, and we duke it out, and then I come back hopefully victorious. And all this other stuff, and it becomes this thing. It's like, no, I'm not one of them. I'm the one who fights the bad guys, the bad magicians who are witches who are willing to sell their souls for.
I'm not one of them. I'm one of us.
I'm a good Christian, right?
Phrase, a witch is always found at the point of an extended finger. The witch is the other, not you. You're not a witch. I find a few things raised really beautifully by the Witch of Endor. One, it's always poked problems in the existence of necromancy for Christians. Yes, and necromancy is viewed as and it plays into what the concepts of necromancy are, which is incredibly important for this show. That necromancy is, of course, dealing with dead people and demons, because of the proclivities of the church to say that there is no resurrecting of the dead, because this will only occur on Judgment Day or if you're a saint. So you can talk to saints, perhaps, but you can't talk to dead people, because
it's not Helen of Troy. It's 3 demons in a Helen of Troy suit.
Yes, absolutely. Which sometimes it might be, but this idea here that the legitimacy is here because when Spiritism kind of took huge foothold in Latin America and Mexico was going through, like there was a Spiritist president who like had seances every night to determine what his policies were going to be for the next day, and he did pretty well. But this discussion of like what are the justifications for spirit contact in this way, you have not only the Witch of Endor as a possibility, which also is interesting because she's used in Mexican folk magic as a guardian, not for the act of invoking the dead, because you can use Jesus for that, because Jesus talked to dead prophets in the Transfiguration on the Mount. Right. That justifies the communication with the dead already. For sure. So what she does do is she helps identify when the client is trying to test you, because Saul came in disguise and lied. And the Martin Luther translation of this passage is amazing, because he gives credit to the witch that she's not screaming because she sees the spirit. She's screaming because she realizes it's the king, and he just made all acts of necromancy. He still tries to feed the bastard before he leaves. Yeah, I love that she's that hospitable, because you must treat guests with hospitality. But also this idea that she screams because of possibly seeing the dead prophet. But I don't know. It's very complex in its nature, and she's certainly a figure that I think any necromancer should be looking towards. And I've seen whole arguments and discussions back in the old Yahoo list days, which it will soon be amongst the hallowed dead, because in December they're taking all the old Yahoo groups down. But there's this whole thing there of, I guess that is not dead, which can eternal lie, and in the web archive you can still find. But there's something to her of being this figure that's incredibly enigmatic. She's obviously powerful, and he's actively engaging in again going against God, because he believes that his law is of God, and that the prophet first is upset with Saul for disobeying God, right, and predicts his downfall. And there's this, I don't know, it's just she's fascinating, and she's accurate too. Like it's not like she's a quack there. No, far from it. That's the problem. Yeah. She's good at it. But I do love this idea of you open it up to the passage, and that's what you put the candle on to call her. Very, very Mexican way of doing things. There's to do with powders and things like that, but to make sure that you notice the testers when they come, or to have warning if you are doing illegal acts of mediumship and things like this, that you know when to push the button and the bookshelf turns around. Like, how can this be? Can she guard this kind of thing? Is she the Jesus Malverde of her time? Wow. Of that thing of like, can she keep the law away in this way by hiding this notion? And I find that fascinating. Fascinating. That also the Christian countenance there of like reducing the passage to ash and marking the head just like with the ashes, or mixed with the palms of last year as a blessing for the worker, that it is God sanctioned, and that the laws of man will change, but the laws of God do not.
Do you get the washing the pages? We get that a lot with the Gospel of John, at least, across Europe, of washing the ink off the pages very, very carefully.
That's if you have
that.
Yeah, it doesn't work as well with paper. It works extremely well with parchment, and then you can lick the palimpsest clean in my normal fantastical. But
you and your palimpsest licking.
Yeah. But putting herbs on it or writing out the passage as much as you can on something, and then or writing out the words in herbs and that type of thing, and lighting the candle and that type of thing is known.
It's a fascinating take more broadly on like Christian spirits that aren't saint. I mean, this is mostly what I've been thinking about in the context of some of the workings that our dear friend and ne'er-do-well Professor Porterfield talks about in his Sporting Life. He gives a lot of examples of working with Jezebel and other spirits of powerful women in various Jewish and Christian scriptures, and they're definitely not saints, right? But you can still work with them as biblical spirits or as spirits of the Torah. I find that fascinating.
I think common, dare I say it, folk Catholic expressions of this is that no, but Adam and Eve are saints, and it's not just because of the hallowed ancestors, but like they're
literally saints.
Yeah. Like they are in a minor setting, but in modern Catholicism, you don't hear about them as saints because they're pre-Christian. So this notion that true saints are those that die in the name of Christ, and that the hallowed dead or the harrowed dead, we should say, that were resurrected, or the good pagans that were resurrected during the harrowing of hell, and taken directly into paradise, which leaves the prophet's hell or the prophet's limbo empty, which I find is a fascinating thing. That is possibly one of the ways that Fairy took over hell. Because they saw an empty place in hell because Jesus took all the good pagans and the Jews out, which is its own amazing thing. I also really like the Kipling poem, "On the Road to Endor is the oldest road and the craziest road of all. Straight it runs to the witch's abode, and in the days of Saul, and it did in the days of Saul, and nothing has changed of the sorrow in store for such as go down on the road to Endor." And then, of course, it brings up Endora in Bewitched as like that's a lovely nod to that in that way.
So we have to get back to a point around whose deputies. Whose deputies?
My deputies.
Well, yeah, sometimes Agliarept is under Lucifer. The common one being if put Satanakia as the first deputy, then Agliarept will be the second. They'll be under Lucifer. But there are older and different and contingent and parallel manuscript traditions where Lucifer's Rophocale is the first deputy of Lucifer, which puts Satanakia to the second and shunts Agliarept over to being under Belzebuth. And that's the working style I'm most familiar with, shall we say, on a practical level. I really like thinking about the deputies, which are so huge, and yes, have these offices in the Grand Grimoire, as Kat just intimated. But I also like thinking about them by the guilds, the spirits of the 18 in the Verum, at least, that can kind of be chalked off and attributed under them, which for Agliarept is Mersildi, Clisthert, and Silcade, who rule respectively traveling big distances. Clisthert is interesting in terms of changing day and night is often how it's framed. And then Silcade, who rules the dispensations from spirits. So thinking about, this notion as well of looking at the name and the different derivations of the name Agliarept or Agaleraptor sometimes as well. There's often implied a sense of wings going on here, and that they all seem to be about movement and movement through things, and movement through landscapes. We're back a little bit again to Conjunctio, I feel. Certainly they strike me as somewhat of a ranger's guild, right? Mersildi helping you travel distances, Clisthert helping you with timing of day or night and being seen or not seen as well. And then Silcade, dispensation from spirits as you pass through their sacred sites.
Can you speak a little to the relationship with Agaleraptar?
Yeah, sure. So Agaleraptarkimath are often attributed to rule Agaleraptarkimath. And Agaleraptarkimath we find Agaleraptartor, always
got the tongue so very eloquent.
Yeah, they're lovely, aren't they? The sound of bubbling water itself. It's mentioned as a distinction, an exception that proves the rule, an extra bit of bureaucracy, that we have this nice, neat three chiefs, 6 deputies, a free agent in this form of Skerlin/Sirac, who may be one of the deputies, maybe something different. Then these 18 spirits that get chunked off into 3s under them. But then also some of them, like Putsatanakia, have second lines, as does Neberos. With the 8 under them. But then you also get and also there's this other thing, which is that Tokimiki and Agliarept also rule over Agaleraptarkimath, who is the spirit that rules waters. And that we find Garp turns up in a bunch of different contexts, very gregarious character, cropping up in a variety of spirit lists, usually under a variety of different names, but commonly around water, transportation, sometimes illusion, but generally more about movement and water. Consecration can make love and hate, crucially, which again is interesting to me in terms of the humoral thermodynamics of inducing love and hate, that if you can do one, you can do the other. The two toad bones, the matching ones in either side of the toad. And so there's this sense that Agaleraptarkimath doesn't quite fit under anyone, but has this dual rulership. Who is the only spirit who is said to have 2 deputies most of the time. We're pretty clear that we might have different manuscripts, but we don't have this notion that a subordinate would have 2 reporting managers. What interests me is where the second of Lucifer's deputies, if we're going to think about how this might relate to talking about Quimbanda counterparts and the use of the Grimorium Verum's hierarchical structure, is in the fact that Putsatanakia, as the second of Lucifer's deputies, has a second line, which I call the Professors Guild, which are all spirits that teach magic. Heramael teaching the power of herbs, Sestugriel giving good mandrakes or good familiars, Trimasael teaching the making of oils and the powders of projection, Sergothy, who we talked about previously, giving something around a social engineering, like working people in some way, and specifically women and sometimes children. And that interests me in terms of introducing this notion that we may be talking about tutelary spirits again, we may be talking about dead magicians again, and that this interests me in terms of what I understand and what I'm interested in.
Take a shot every time Al says that.
I just ring a little bell. That interests me in terms of Mangueira's relationship to ancestry and ancestors, and the yellow fruiting sons of those delicious fruits.
I mean, Mangueira is interesting because you have a Gatiso, a spirit of a tree. Specifically, Mangueira means mango tree, not just a fruit. And it's also a fruit that's foreign to Brazil originally. Mangoes come from Asia. Of course, in pre-flood times, they were everywhere. But I think Mangueira cannot be separated from Marabô too much. He has his own independent origin. You made me think about this when you were talking about tutelary spirits or teaching spirits, in the sense that, one of the hallmarks of Quimbanda is that if they're your personal, they're teaching you everything. Like that's
right.
If it is the spirit that you walk with, they become a teaching spirit by their nature. They may not necessarily be one for everyone. And Mangueira is considered an extremely stable, aristocratic Exu, in the sense that, and you can see this just in the fact that a tree has roots and bears fruit, and he tends to talk less than Marabô, but I think it's helpful to understand him as yes, a teaching spirit, one that can be gone to to explain the situations you find yourself in. In my own understanding of the relationship between Marabô and Mangueira, that Marabô articulates and Mangueira, I guess, ruminates or allows for the possibility of rumination. It's the start of discussion and the start of, there's even a shade here, dare I imply, of writing things down. So because if Marabo articulates and Mangueira becomes the note taker, the thing that plants the seed. So there's an influx here that shows the relationship even between, the source of light and lamp black that I've talked about with Menoichi in the past. But I think that there's something there too of that the seed that comes from light must be put into darkness in order to be born. It must germinate. Most seeds do not surface germinate. So it needs to go into the darkness, which is Mangueira's job. So it's an interesting thing of taking that seed of light and that articulation and then allowing it to germinate, to ruminate, to become something more mature than just its previous articulation. And it's a very heady thing. I mean, what has he gone to very heavily for in Quimbanda? Like small favors. He's very good at turning fortune around. He being recognized, being to gain prosperity, material success, attraction, definitely that. He's notedly moustachio'd Eshu, and is known for twirling his mustache in some houses when he comes down in possession, whether the mount has one or not, and is swashbuckling. He has a sword, and is often said to be another synchronization there in some ways as Mephistopheles. There we go.
Right.
Bless you.
Yes, sing. So I think there's something really interesting there about the nature of pacts and the pact as a germination element that we sign based upon the needs of what are in the light, but the pact itself must be gone over very carefully. And so I think that there's a hint here in a relationship to other Eshus, and when you're dealing with things like Capapreta and the cape of ink that you now find yourself under, that this Mephistopheles Faustian complex, right, of like, what is it that you're signing? Which ties into the nature of sacrifice that we're talking about, and perhaps reflects the conjunctio very well. And what's interesting about the figure of conjunctio is it looks like a tree to me, which I've always...
Yes, the way the branches and and they reflect each other hourglassily. Yeah.
And so there's something very interesting there because the fruits of the mango, which the tree itself is palmate, it goes out in many little tiny expressions over it. So it's got like a little hand of leaves every so often. And plus the mango itself, they're very prominent. They look like giant testicles hanging down. They're not a subtle fruit, and they're usually covering the tree in large amounts. So it's it also has a strange, I like the relationship with the mango, just that it's a citrus, but it's grainy like a pear. Like it has that kind of citrusy boost. It's not a citrus fruit, but I mean it has that kind of brighter fruit flavor. And the pit is not horribly defined. There's a point where it's too hard, but there's a point where it's like a boundary in the middle of it. Like it just...
It isn't stone fruit. You can't just easily excavate that. Yeah, it's a fibrous point at which it's gone from eatable flesh to non-eatable flesh.
Yes, and that beautiful yellowish, orangish, reddish that starts off green, but this invocation of the sun that is underground, that yellow sun that is the ancestral sun, being brought forth. So that which we take from today's world, bury, comes back again. So there's this natural ancestral thing of like, if it's written word and the nature of the dead, the things that we learned in yesteryear come back to fruition. It allows for the next column of working to be done through the goat Eshu and through his deputies and all the way to the King of the Seven Crossroads. And, it is side of it that I think Mangueira comes down to secure the temple, to cleanse it very powerfully, to oversee initiations and pacts. He's not as commonly a mount as, say, Marabo, who is very gregarious and very outspoken, whereas Mangueira tends to be quieter. But they are very similar. And I think if it weren't for the fact that you don't usually see Marabo twirling his mustache or stroking his invisible beard as much, they would act very similar to each other. In my experience, generally, I've seen Mangueira stand up more than Marabo, who's typically hunched over, but that doesn't mean that Mangueira doesn't come hunched over. But those details are different between each groups, and seeing him, I've seen Mangueira come down in Candomblé temples and Umbanda temples. Rare, I've seen Marabo come down more in Candomblé and Quimbanda, like groups that call themselves Quimbanda primarily. But not that that's just my experience on who I've seen. There's 44,000 registered potatoes in Sao Paulo alone. So it's like, it's not like I'm going to have seen a survey to represent all of any of these shows.
With the hourglass sort of notion of conjunctio, I was wondering like about the temporality of it, right? You've mentioned before with Marabo sort of voicing the devil, the first manifestation of Kala, right? And then you have this eloquent articulation that happens, but to work, it passes through the mango tree and the roots put in the soil, which is the temporality, right? Like putting it into the now. It's quite fascinating, the dynamic that occurs there when the notion of like all this, like what the branches that receive sunlight, but then the roots that, penetrate into the soil and feed it and nourish it and are nourished by it. Yeah.
Again, we're back to that core thing that we tend to circle around when we're talking about a lot of folk necromantic stuff, that the good tree, the good solid trunk has both roots that stretch into the humus of that which came before, and branching, reaching blossoms that experience the sun in new ways and further crown it.
I mean, in these episodes that are somewhat slightly designed, it's interesting to when the things that I don't remember designing fit together. Like, I really do think there's some interesting noddings between the Witch of Endor and Mangueira. And even the nature of the tour, which of course it floods Quimbanda in many ways. To revisit the Bizuar briefly there, I think it's an interesting consideration, because it is a rock not of natural. It's natural in its creation, but considered unnatural in its frequency in that way, I guess, of like, it's not a desired thing unless you're a Bezoar hunter, of which there are many websites that you can go to that of course claim to be selling many Bezoars. Like the centipede stone is a huge one in China, right? The Bezoar that
Indonesian Bezoar websites.
It's intense because of the Muslim influence there, right? So the Indonesian ones are huge. Horse chokes, for instance, which is in the esophagus. There's different ones, different styles of bezoars that are formed. There could be the food bolus ones that you get from cow cud balls, which are really, they're like a bezoar, but they're not, because it's just hardened food that comes up, and it's these cud chewing animals that the food is going from stomach chamber to stomach chamber to stomach chamber. The human formed lactobezoar. I had a friend whose baby had a lactobezoar, which is
ooh, that's fun.
Weird milk that's solidified in the body. You also see ones that are formed from medication that's not properly entering into the system. So then you talk about it like, well, if you know the animal or the person has a reaction, could you create your own bezoars? There's the trico bezoar, which is the normal hairball ones that get very, this classic bezoars there.
Right, phyto bezoar as well, right? They're often, those are interchangeable terms sometimes, from what I gather.
Cellulose, with that type of thing. Diospyro bezoar, I don't know what else I'm going to know. Sorry, from unripe persimmons specifically, and the Coca-Cola is a remedy. I mean, that's just fascinating.
What?
What? Yeah, it's a specific type of phytobezoar formed from unripe persimmons, and then Coca-Cola helps dissolve it, because you can put a nail in Coca-Cola.
Oh yeah.
That shows you how powerful our stomachs are, that we can contain it.
Who'd have thought that cocaine wine could be so bad for you?
Not me. I mean, that's good shit. And it seems to be definitely, extensive, like the Picatrix is like the bezoar. It loves its bezoar tech. Yeah, bezoar references.
Yeah.
It seems to be, the word in fact just means antidote, right? And it
that which expels, I've heard it as zoar, expeller of poison. So less counter poison or antidote, and literally that which gets pushed out, because it itself is also pushed out.
Interesting.
Yeah. Another kind of pellery.
Fascinating with how it itself collects things, residue, forms, and then eventually, is leaving. But like that's super fascinating. Is like this, because we talked a bit before with the bones, right? And like how they can take on other qualities. You can name them to be someone else, or you can transfer their properties, of like this one person who was cursed, and now I'm going to use their bones to curse someone else, And so it's fascinating that what pushes out the poison.
Yes.
I believe you're referring to the Persian word, right? Ends up becoming instead of this thing that just neutralizes it in a way, it literally like forces it out, like be gone.
Yeah, and that the blockage in being pushed out forms the means of cleansing everything else that was in the way of the passage, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting too, that notion of what antidote is, because certainly antidote can include purgatives, like consider the universal antidote because it just makes you vomit everything.
Right.
But we do have this idea of neutralization through antidote of like, the chemical counteracts it,
right,
and nullifies it in that way, which is also quite interesting that there's a counterpart, a god and an anti-god.
Yeah, poison law gets weird in terms of humoral theory because for a long time there are many poisons that didn't seem to operate by any consistent manifest quality. It didn't seem to always make you hotter or colder or drier or moister or part of the body like that. And so they often got classed with the non-manifest qualities, which are exactly as tautological as Ben Jonson criticizes them to be. Why does this poison make someone sleepy? Well, because it has dormative virtues, right? It's circular, right? But those were how our Aristotelian scholasticists had to approach a lot of poisons, and so an awful lot of like very particular exceptions are built up in the lore of the European occult philosophy of poison.
I also really love the history and tie into Caveat Emptor, which is over a fraudulent Bezoar case, and it's your people again. It's a common law of England, it's your period at that 1600s, early 1600s. Announces the rule of Caveat Emptor to make sure that it's up to you, buyer person. So it reminds me of those Indonesian Bezoar sites of like, how do I know what you're selling me is really like the third Bezoar to be extracted on the new moon of a horse, or
the ones that come from like dragons even, and like reflect, and they're like weird and like translucent and look like glowy balls.
Yeah, they're that's often like, oh, we've heard of this other one. It's not like the one we have, but like, it's like see-through and it kind of glows.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more like a glass or something.
Yeah, and it makes me just think of like the demand, for something that becomes like the hot topic in magic or in whatever curative thing that you're doing with it, is like, well, we got to have the tech that you guys don't have, right? So it becomes this thing of like, well, you guys have it from this animal. Well, I got it from, this deva, whatever.
Right. It's also such an exoticized medicine anyway, that it's comes to prominence in Europe as far as I can tell from a bunch of people deciding it's worth looking at all of these Arabic physicians and philosophers and occultists, all seemingly talking about how great it is. And so it's again the magpie eyes of the pragmatic healer and magician.
Well, if it's great, then I want to have 5 of them.
Exactly.
That'll be nothing compared to my 5,000. Next week, our next episode, the folk Catholic uses of the Virgin Mary's Bezoar, which would actually be a really wonderful pamphlet to write. I find that again the Bezoar and Conjunctio, like the space that is now occluded in the center, especially the throat is closed, and therefore the stomach, right, or the heart, depending on which thing you're going there, it enters, but it has no. Can it be passed through? I don't know. It's interesting that Conjunctio starts to echo the notion of a Bezoar in a way that Carco cannot.
The little choke point in the middle.
And again, like that, which is in terms of like the kind of conversations we've had about epistemology and knowledge and language and things, that which can be consumed and chewed but never digested necessarily. The gristle of meaning. Right, that which can only be passed. I don't know.
And then you get into the Tibetan thing of where some of the sutras come from, that they cannot be understood in the current time that you pass them, or perhaps even Masonic references of like that, and the hope that maybe in future generations,
right,
it will come to light, or that we will be ready for this sutra because it was buried in a treasure chest under an island guarded by a yeti and his bride. Like, do you replant the mango to bear and make it bear fruit again?
The mango seeds in the pocket allow for them to be planted anywhere in the future, but the one here now actually has mangoes.
Yes.
And then we talked about sacrifice, and just I love the idea of like something being trapped. The air cannot pass through the throat in the same way, or that things cannot be digested in the same way because of the bezoar being lodged in there. So the breath that cannot be expressed, that's being caught in the thing that now becomes this coagulated, built upon stone. And what is it hiding? What are the generations of the folds of the rings of the tree or whatever that's in the bezoar? That then come with it.
The concretions themselves are a kind of tree ring.
It's like
that's beautiful.
Thank you. It's like when you hold back and you can't say something. What is swallowed, right? What is the spit that returns down? The things that are unspoken, and little ghosts of those things. I was thinking about the idea of the bezoar lodged in the esophagus or whatever. And
the
how it must be
around. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the patina around the frog in the throat.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that very much, Kat. And of course, like looking at how frogs in medieval heraldry are distinct from toads, which you talked about before, being beautifully grumpy, hateful creatures that want to spit the venom of melancholy and choler at humanity. Frogs, on the other hand, are mainly known for their the loudness at which they court and mate, and so they're a loud sex animal. So there's an importance of the throat, and yeah, if we're looking at it conjunctio, definitely fucks, albeit as ships passing in the night and knocking boots of itchy feet rather than holding hands in marital union. And on a sex gag, excellent.
The notion of pearls before swine comes in there too, and it's just pearl, obviously not a bezoar in the same way, but still a bezoar. And one that, what do you hold on to and what can be allowed to ruminate further so that it becomes perfected. Knowing when to speak. And certainly within the context of the Pythoness of Endor and the serpent speech that she elaborates of like, when do you speak and what does it do to speak? What does it do to tell people what they ask for? Is it what they need? And that editing process is of course interesting to me, and it's something that I think Mangueira is concerned with as well. And Datura and this notion of always you enter the unknown with Mama Verde. It's going to be a walk in her domain, not yours. Mm-hmm. And that side of it is there. There will be an intersection of something, but which side of the crossroads you find yourself on the next day is not up to you. At least not with something like the Tura. Perhaps it is more with some of the other things we discussed.
That notion of like contemplation is really fascinating in terms of looking at the four main means of using bezoar that are identified. There's touching it, there's carrying it, there's obviously crushing it up and drinking it, which starts to take on more pharmacological uses. But then there's also a big tradition of regarding it, of looking at it, being and examining it, being itself a way of, that is part of its medicine as well. That's part of its virtue to affect things as well. That contemplating the thing is part of the thing.
Oh, just like imagining the thing is almost like doing the thing. It's
I don't know about that. No, I think it's less like, oh, you can have an image of it and that'll do the job. I think it's more that just sitting and staring at it. You still need the actual bezoar, right? But the idea of like regarding it, not thinking about it, but meditating on it in front of you. It was also said to be
from an allyship model, that if you truly meet the bezoar, you will never have to have it physically again. That like that's part of plant medicine, is that meeting the plant means that you do not necessarily physically need the plant ever again, that you know how to call its medicine. And the point of making allies, right? That they'll come when you call. Right. Which is an interesting side of things too, that I wonder about that, like how much our materialistic framework inhibits our magic in that way. Battle with like, can you grab a bunch of ingredients and put them into a jar and put oil over them and say like, look at all these rare things that are in this thing. Well, sure, but how did it get animated? And what is the unifying principle? What's the general in there that's telling those things how to operate in proportion? Like what's its motor as opposed to what's its constituent parts? This human blender, but you're not creating life by duplicating it.
Right. This also speaks to me of the lodging of medicines in a body as well, like the bezoar of when do we augment ourselves? When are like, when does the stone that gets put in us so that we can do magic, or the witch soul that's added to us, or the animal part that's added to us, along with what's taken away, what gets lodged in us and slowly, concretes layers and patinas around it? Like what do we carry inside us to be able to reach in and get those things?
Yeah, and it's so great that you bring that up, because I was just thinking with the whole discussion earlier about, the parts of the soul that are taken away and some shredded to ribbons and interwoven with new things, including plants and animals, and the traditions I'm familiar with, the witch then can assume the shape of that animal whenever she wishes in spirit form or whatever. She can also call those animals when they're around her and so on. But the plants, its song is learned and it can be sung. And now that it's there essentially in the magic, it's that plant can now through her body intervene in the whatever magic that she's wielding, because she can grasp and strangle things like its vines, or she knows how to make things act in the way that the plant acts upon the world. Same with the animals that are in her, or if she has a different ally like a dragon or a fairy, these things are part of the magic. So there's nothing that, even if it's not like technically quote unquote, well, this is not something that's very in my experience like thought of in this way, but if it's not like her brand of witchcraft, it all is. It all becomes kind of carnivorously consumed, right. And sort of, and this weird Frankensteinian way, you get, it's like, it's all now her magic. Like even when she's not like calling her fairy, like Vila or her Zmai, like it's always like the claws are always there, because it's part of her lifeblood now, right? And so as a result, then, like, do you, the question is like, what happens when you live apart from your materials? It's like, well, you're a witch even when you're in prison, when you're stripped away from all of your fancy tools, which in the Balkan context are usually kitchen supplies, right. The knife that you also happen to use for other things, or in some cases there's ones that are buried and not used. But, it's like the scythe or the sickle that's taking over people's heads so they're cleared of certain things and possessing influences, like when you're away from all of them, where's your power? For the witch, it's already in her, right? So she has all her allies with her at all times, and it affects every magic that she does. Whereas the human hand which reads the book and makes spirit pacts, and is changed by those things, certainly, and every act of rereading the book, and so on, and then re-engaging those contacts, like at the end of the day, it's like the witch's hand is also scaly and furry and vine-like, because it comes with those pacts that were made, and those things act the way that she acts now. She's part of them, not quite them, but so you don't need to plant anymore in a sense.
I don't dance. Okay, great.
That was on you.
I love it. That's the mic drop.
Yeah. You remind me of something I was just discussing in the Baraja Española class. That was oftentimes when you give a deck to a spirit to work with, there's this ownership that happens in the West with cards, right? That's my tarot deck. And partially because tarot decks were rare, but when you're a playing card reader, playing cards are very easy to get. So, Baraja Española is Spanish playing cards. If I were to give one to a spirit and literally they have the deck, that means that they have access to any deck that I use from that point on if I've introduced them to that deck properly, because they have theirs. And so they can simultaneously be linked to any deck that I use, which is a different thing than always borrowing their deck to do readings as if they have the exclusive ownership of it, as opposed to empowering your ownership of it. Right. Which is a different thing. So the idea that if you give a ladder to Ogun because you were told to in a reading, or you really want to, or whatever this is, and, Ogun has a ladder, but could you then think about that every time you're climbing a ladder or doing something? Could that be a way to draw it back to you in that way?
It's the act of giving that deck, not the object of the deck.
Yeah, or at least a marriage of the two in some way. Because the giving of the deck is important. The giving of a physical deck is important. The giving of a small ladder to Ogun might then give you access to larger ladders in life that are both metaphorical and physical, whether it's social going through the social ladders, or because you work on ladders constantly. You're not going to give him your 80-foot ladder that you use for your job. But you might in some way give it to him, give it over to him, perhaps. I don't know. It just raises those interesting possibilities of how we can interact, like the preciousness or the notion of separating too many tool sets of there's a hammer in Ogun's tools, but there are people that keep a physical hammer, the house's hammer, in his pot. And when they need to use a hammer, they pull it out of his pot and use it. This is the constant, was a hotbed of conversation in the Yahoo groups in the late 90s for sure, of can the Athame ever actually cut things? And there was the tradition of it being the Athame, the blood letter, which Chumley promoted very heavily in his glossary in Kutub, which was the first time I think many people saw that in print through his explication of that. But then the people that said, I only have one knife and it cuts when I want it to cut and it doesn't cut when I don't want it to cut. Versus the bloodletting knife versus the knife that is utilitarian, which seems to be more of the kind of Wiccan division versus the black hilted and the white hilted knife of Solomonic grimoire. Just these notions of things of one of the markers of traditional craft in its 90s incarnation and early 2000s was the utilitarian notion of like, it's a knife and I'm telling you that this is the knife I'm using right now. That tools had practical virtue, that there was not this secreting away of every ritual tool. There might be a way to call it, but it was consecration through use and intent, not necessarily prayer and intent or consecration and special thing. It was empowered to do its job to cut. A knife wants to cut.
Yeah, which shortcuts a lot of the problems that you have with lodge-based consecrations of tools, in that you need one tool to consecrate the other tool, but you need the other tool to consecrate the other tool. And so you have to like try and work out a way of bootstrapping yourself.
If you had contact with the original lodge, but you're a folk lodge, you see. Oh well, that just went darker than it. And I will still call myself a folk Catholic, but it's something interesting there. We have been told that sometimes these episodes are dense, and I would like to claim any culpability for making them dense and not put that on Katarina, who is just full of amazing information. I wish she'd talk all day, every day, and I think we'll have her back for another episode very soon.
Yes.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for contributing. But I think it is a time in the program for a new section that we've never really done before, Al. Yes, I was going to ask both of you, and then maybe myself, what's going on in the next few months for you? Is there anything you'd like to promote? The goal of this podcast has never been to be like, buy this thing and do this thing, and I wrote these things. But like, I also know that a lot of people are very interested in those things, and I know that both of you have perhaps things that you want to talk about and have published something that, where could people do those things of publishing and recognizing you and validating you on Instagram?
It's at Grimos on tape, at Grimos on tape, at Grimos on tape. Just once. Love me. Thanks. No, I have the only thing that jumps to mind is in just under 2 weeks I'll be doing another round of my Gifts of the Magi webinar course, which is 3 classes, again offered through those handsome chaps at Wolf and Goat. And we'll be talking about Magian, medieval, early modern, and modern cultus, and how to be doing the magics of safe travel and detection and conjuring spirits under the patronage of the 3 holy kings of Cologne. And that's starting on the 5th of December. So hopefully, if folks are interested.
Have another round of the foundation course, Geomancy, starting, I believe, in January.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, also super at the top of the year. I think it's the 7th or the 8th. Let me check that. But yes, I'm very excited to do another round of that. I quite like talking about geomancy. You may not know that about me. It's Thursday, 9th of January that'll start.
And I'm going to announce it publicly just so I pressure him into it, that I've recently said that he needs to do a Cunningman course, and we've talked over drinks quite extensively about what that might look like, and I'm really excited that is a possibility. Perhaps not the next few months, but sooner rather than later in the wheel.
Yeah. Something on looking at what cunning craft was and parsing out when it's a tradition and when it's a set of practices by the folk called cunning. And those kinds of things, and what that means in a modern context, as well as going through a bunch of historical material and looking at how
that's
we can
exciting.
apply that.
Treadwell's coming up too.
Yes, December 12th. I'm talking about a practical syllabus of early modern necromancy based off a passage in Thomas Blatt's Glossographia, which is a dictionary of weird words. But he gives, rather than just saying, "Oh, it's a bad magician," or "It's someone who conjures the dead, he gives this incredibly detailed syllabus of like, it's a person who wears black and goes hungry and lodges amongst graves and incubates dreams to meet the devil or to meet a dead person or the devil in the shape of a dead person, and uses these incenses and these sacred words and these bits and pieces. And so drawing all that together as a hit list of like, this actually looks like some kind of set of practices that are consistent and we could form a syllabus around. And that's also me playtesting a version of that talk that I'll end up doing at the International Necromancy Consortium in March down in NOLA.
Oh, where all three of us are.
We're all
Yes, that is when we three shall meet again, if not sooner, I hope.
Yes, hopefully in the fog and filthy air, if not before then, or after then in physicality. But yes, the International Necromancy Consortium's first meeting conference is in the last weekend of March, I believe. Mm-hmm. It's the week after the Cyprian conference that Elisabeth is doing. So
where I'll see you again.
Hooray!
Yay!
Yes. Oh no, we'll see each other there.
Yes.
Oh, brilliant! Nice one.
So it's 2 weekends in a row. What will we do?
Necromancers on tour. Awesome.
Remember, Al needs to be shipped in a coffin of crumpets and tea.
It's true.
Yes, this is how proper British vampires maintain their British citizenship while traveling.
Some of us have style.
Yes. Tied in a rug of cat fur or something.
Oh, yes, that must be spun on some crumpetsmas. Yeah.
Yes. And Katarina, are there any talks or publications you would like to promote? I'm saying publications so that you be sure to grab her booklet from the Haitians on Smai and the folklore there, and harass her to write more, of course.
Yes, I'm working on more pamphlets and also some other things for Haiti. And yeah, this my one is out if you want to learn briefly about sort of dragon folklore and how it's different in Eastern Europe, and dragon marriages, dragon children, and so on. And then I'm working on some on vampires and werewolves and saints and so on. I'm giving a talk in the International Necromancy Consortium in NOLA on Balkan necromancy and folk practices around that I'm quite excited to put together and share with you all. And yeah, I'm working on a course, so we'll see where it goes. But yeah, I'm planning on not just talking to lovely people about things, but also writing them down, which is its own torturous process, But yeah, so I'm really looking forward to publishing a lot more on just the Balkan side of things as I work through all the lovely new sources that I have.
That's really ace.
Mm-hmm.
I may be doing a version of The Woman Clothed with the Sun in person, which is exploration into the Virgin Guadalupe's history and her use as a font of folk magic, and the complexity that is syncretism and Mexican folk magic during her feast days. Or it may be just solely online. I'm not sure yet. But I'll decide that very soon because it's coming up. And I'll be traveling apparently with Al come the new year. We will be at not speaking, but in eager anticipation of the Cyprian conference, and then followed by the International Necromancy Consortium in March, where I'll be speaking on Las Animas Solas, as well as the singular Anima Sola, but the concept of Anima Sola in Hispanic folk Catholicism and the Holy Souls of Purgatory. So accompanying the various forms in which we find Anima Sola, as well as the cult to the souls in purgatory, which is more old world, and then individual purgatorian-bound souls within the new world, like Juan Minero and Maria Bennego and others that are like that. So it's a fun side to that. And I just got accepted to the next year's VGS. Happening until I think it's July, but always preparing for that. So writing that stuff for that, which is focusing almost completely on Santísima Muerte and the herbal lore associated with her. So if that's something you're interested in, please. The VGS is an amazing conference. It's so nice to kind of be in a witch plant nerd camp for the weekend, and be locked there and see people that I've known going there for 5 years and continue to expand and contract and talk plants. I love that conference because the basis of it is plant nerd, and then most people are magical practitioners on top of that. So I love the place where it's a slightly different angle in And that's really that's way in the distant future, and there's hopefully many more interactions and episodes and things to keep current, but these are our immediate plannings. And Al has further, as we mentioned earlier, has is it pre-orders are available in December for the excellent book?
Should be, yes. Should be either at the end of this month or by December. Yeah, pre-orders through Scarlet Imprint of the text that my friend and colleague Phil Legard and I have been putting together for a fair old while on looking at the excellent book of the Art of Magic, a grimoire and the scrying record of the reception of the grimoire, detailing some operations around 1567 by two operators who will almost certainly Humphrey Gilbert and John Davies. Precede obviously the experiments of Dee and Kelly by 20 years. They all know each other as well, obviously, because like British comedy and television in general, there are only 9 actors that we have to share. So yeah, I'm very excited to get that out, and that's the text itself, which is fascinating, full of tutelary shades of Agrippa and dead magicians, Agrippa and Roger Bacon, and as well as Job and Saint Luke.
Is this the text that turned you on to the importance of that?
It's certainly one of the ones that solidified it as something that wasn't just an idle speculation on my part. Yeah, for sure. But there's other aspects of it as well that are really interesting. Having just finished the course on the 4 regents or the 4 kings, Oriens et al. They're in there. They play a very important role, and more widely the system, if we want to call it that is explicated in the excellent book, is not a particular system of magic that is channeled like Dee and Kelly do a couple times, depending on how many forms of things called Enochian we want to kind of chunk into. But rather, it's a process by which the operator and scryer visit the House of Solomon and through a series of operations visit the trees of blood and crystal at the center of the house that are fruiting books that one picks off the vine and then brings back to the real world. So it is not just a particular set of channeled operative grimoires. It is a means by which one can channel a variety, like a potentially huge storehouse of systems. It's a meta channeling,
like the Jewel Tree of Tibet meditations. It's lovely.
Yeah, it's a great grimoire, and I'm really, really genuinely excited for people to get stuck in with it. It's been a project I've been working on for a good while, and delighted to have got to work on it with Phil, who has done fantastic work in terms of pulling other contemporaneous operations involving Azazel and the 4 kings and various other bits that it looks similar to, so giving a context for it. And obviously delighted to be doing it with Peter and Alkistis of Scarlet Imprint, who are dear pals, as well as, very gifted and determined magicians in their own right.
Lovely. Well, I think that's probably a good place to end. And thank you to Katarina for always the chats, but this time recording it.
Yes, thank you so much. You make us sound,
for having me.
You make us sound so much smarter.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Of course, made me the first of many. And thank you all for listening. And I hope this finds you well. We hope to record another episode soon. But may a happy posthumous, because we're recording it after the fact, posthumous feast of the Holy Relics. And may your bezoars find fruition and expansion of your knowledge, as opposed to just getting stuck in your throat. And yes, feel free to help out anytime, Al. May all your mango trees not drop mangoes on your head, but rather in your bellies. And the Witch of Endor is awesome. So all hail Ob, whatever it is.
Right. Yeah.
And, if you are running through the forest being chased by a woman in a green dress with galloping plant tendrils chasing after you like hellhounds, you probably overdosed on Datura. Apologize to her, and it will all be okay.
Stop, drop, and roll.
Stop, drop, and pray. So
unless you went there willingly to be transmogrified into something inhuman.
Exactly. If you are going to give up your humanity, may it be willing. And if you'd like to retain it and be a sorcerer, then don't drink the broth. I drink of my sisters.
Manon, these are my gifts.
All right, loves. I think that's it. I think we're good. And thank you so much.
Glorious. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.